Welcome to the channel. We're so glad you're here. If you enjoy this video, don't forget to click like and subscribe to stay updated with our latest content. Your support helps us create more awesome videos for you. Let us know what you think in the comments below. Enjoy the video. The Unforeseen Peril of Delamere Forest. It happened during the sweltering days of July 2011. A small cohort of us, myself included, had the notion to embark on a modest camping excursion. Our chosen destination was Delamere Forest, a verdant haven a mere stone's throw from our bustling metropolis of Chester. Although relatively diminutive in size, Delamere offered a much longed-for respite, an opportunity to commune with the natural world, far from the sometimes oppressive concrete jungle of city life. Any prospect of escaping to the tranquil countryside was eagerly embraced. However, as the days dwindled and the designated date of our adventure drew nearer, our meticulously laid plans began to crumble. One by one, like dominoes falling in succession, my companions contacted me, each with their own lamentable excuse. There were unforeseen family emergencies, a sudden and inconvenient lack of funds, or, in some cases, simple, unadulterated lethargy. Ultimately, only two of us remained steadfast in our commitment, myself and my closest confidant, Arthur. So it was that on a radiant, sun-drenched morning, we boarded a train, embarking on the relatively short journey to our sylvan retreat. The weather was impeccable, a cerulean sky, unblemished by even the faintest wisp of a cloud, and a gentle zephyr that rendered the subsequent hike through the dense woodland far less arduous than we had initially anticipated. It wasn't long before we stumbled upon a seemingly idyllic location, nestled in the cool embrace of the shade, and conveniently situated adjacent to a babbling brook, which would serve as our source for both ablutions and hydration. There was, however, a singular, rather significant drawback. The spot was conspicuously exposed, readily visible to any casual passersby, and lacked even the slightest pretense of seclusion. It was the late afternoon. We were weary, bone-tired from our trek, and, driven by the pangs of hunger, we resolved to construct a campfire, the intention being to prepare a rudimentary supper. This, as any seasoned camper knows, is a quintessential element of the outdoor experience. But with every plus there is an added minus. In this case, it is that it also serves as an inadvertent beacon. A fire, the fragrance of burning wood, the tantalizing aroma of cooking food, the ascending plume of smoke. It's tantamount to broadcasting your presence to the entire forest with a loudspeaker. We were acutely aware of this inherent risk, and thus, when a group of local inhabitants eventually stumbled upon our humble encampment and ambled down to extend their greetings, our surprise was tempered by a degree of weary expectation. Initially, they projected an aura of amiable conviviality, and, while this narrative may sound overly suspicious, there was a subtle undercurrent of unease that gnawed at me. It's a phenomenon that continues to fascinate me, the way in which human intuition can detect these minuscule, almost imperceptible cues, subtle inflections in body language or vocal intonation, that collectively lead us to suspect that an individual is not being entirely forthright. I couldn't definitively pinpoint the source of my apprehension. Perhaps it was the surreptitious glances exchanged between the locals, or the oddly intrusive nature of their inquiries. Whatever the cause, I was convinced that their intentions were far from benevolent. When, at last, they departed, moving beyond the range of our hearing, Arthur, my typically timid companion, the one I perpetually urged to relax and chill out, surprisingly advocated for immediate relocation. On this particular occasion, however, I recognized the undeniable validity of his concern. Perhaps we were indulging in a touch of paranoia, but in such precarious circumstances, it's invariably prudent to err on the side of caution. Therefore, despite our profound exhaustion and the lingering effects of the alcohol we had imbibed, we diligently gathered our belongings, meticulously extinguished the embers of our fire, and commenced the search for a more secure location. The churchyard scream. This transpired several years ago, in a quaint English borough I used to call home. My circle of friends and I had enjoyed an evening out in the town center, possibly attending a cinema showing or some similar amusement. We were retracing our steps, heading towards the residence of one of our companions, a route I had traversed countless times previously, on foot without incident. As we neared a venerable, stone-built church, our boisterous merriment was abruptly interrupted by a sound that sent shivers down our spines. A blood-curdling, guttural scream. Initially, we speculated that the source emanated from across the thoroughfare, where a derelict structure stood in a state of disrepair. However, as the screams persisted, escalating in intensity, we realized, with growing horror, that they originated from behind us, within the confines of the churchyard. We considered the possibility that it might be a group of mischievous youths engaging in some ill-advised prank. Nevertheless, our morbid curiosity overwhelmed our apprehension. We cautiously ventured into the churchyard, our footsteps muffled by the damp grass, attempting to pinpoint the precise location of the harrowing cries. It's safe to say that, at this juncture, a palpable sense of dread permeated our group. The screams were truly horrifying, evoking images of unspeakable violence, as if someone were being subjected to the most brutal of torments. I retrieved my mobile phone, my hands trembling slightly, and contacted the local constabulary. All the while, the screams continued, their volume intensifying as we drew closer to the imposing edifice of the church. The police dispatcher, in a calm, measured tone, inquired about our precise location, the nature of the sounds we were hearing, endeavoring to reassure us and maintain a semblance of order. My companions, however, were rapidly succumbing to panic. It was then, with a sudden, almost theatrical flourish, that the exterior lights of the church illuminated the graveyard, casting long, eerie shadows across the ancient headstones. Instinctively, we ducked for cover, seeking refuge behind the weathered granite and marble monuments, our hearts pounding in our chests. Then, just as abruptly as they had flickered to life, the lights were extinguished, plunging us back into darkness. This unsettling sequence repeated itself on, then off, then on and off once more. At that precise moment, any lingering desire to investigate further evaporated. We hastily retreated, fleeing the unsettling scene with a speed born of pure, unadulterated terror. The police contacted me again a few minutes later, when we had reached a safer distance down the road. They informed me that officers had arrived at the church and conducted a thorough search of the premises. However, they had encountered nothing, neither seen nor heard anything untoward. I inquired whether the lights had been illuminated or any doors found unlocked, but they confirmed that the entire property was securely sealed and no lights were on. To this very day, I remain utterly baffled by the events of that night. In all honesty, the incident had faded from my memory, relegated to the dusty archives of forgotten experiences, until a recent conversation with one of my friends resurrected it from the depths of my subconscious. We had collectively dismissed it as a peculiar, inexplicable occurrence, a fleeting anomaly in the fabric of reality. Yet, there was something about those screams, something so primal and unsettling, that even now, years later, it evokes a profound sense of unease. The shadow in the bakery cellar. The instant I glimpsed the concealed hatch beneath the flour sacks in the old bakery cellar, a premonition of danger shivered down my spine. It wasn't on any of the building schematics, a hidden anomaly in a space I thought I knew. As I extended a hesitant hand towards the oddly angled door, my pulse hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I, Eleanor Vance, a mere apprentice caregiver, was about to stumble into a reality far removed from the quiet, predictable life I'd known. My evenings had been spent caring for the elderly Mr. Dubois, the bakery's owner, a gentle, if somewhat withdrawn, gentleman. The Dubois residence was a relic of a bygone era, situated in one of those opulent, tree-lined neighborhoods where manicured lawns stretched like emerald carpets and the vehicles parked in driveways carried price tags that rivaled a small nation's GDP. I never gave the family's personal life much consideration, beyond the perfunctory exchanges we had. Mr. Dubois was unfailingly courteous, though a palpable distance hung about him. His son, Arthur, who frequently visited, possessed a warmth that bordered on effusive. They presented a facade of normalcy, perhaps even bordering on the mundane. But ordinary individuals don't construct clandestine chambers brimming with clandestine monitors and documents that whispered of intrigue. It began, as most extraordinary events do, on a remarkably typical Wednesday evening. I arrived at precisely 6 p.m., just as Arthur was preparing to depart. He relayed his father's customary evening routine: medication at 7:30, a light supper at 8 o'clock, and then bed. I offered a practiced nod, my thoughts already drifting to the university coursework that awaited me once Mr. Du Bois was comfortably settled. The evening unfolded with the smooth predictability of a well-rehearsed play. I assisted Mr. Du Bois with his medication, prepared a simple meal, and engaged in the usual, undemanding conversation about the weather and the local news. By 8:30 p.m., the house fell silent, the only sound the gentle ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall. I found a seat in the plush living room, ready to lose myself in a dense tome on the complexities of Byzantine politics. That's when the subtle dissonance registered. A faint, rhythmic hum, originating, I suspected, from the cellar. Initially, I dismissed it as the aging furnace laboring to maintain the house's warmth. But the hum persisted, an almost imperceptible vibration that felt distinctly out of character for the otherwise still house. My attempts to ignore it proved futile. An insatiable curiosity, a trait that had often led me into trouble as a child, propelled me from the comfort of the sofa. I made my way to the cellar door, the hum intensifying with each descending step. My hand, now slick with a nervous perspiration, traced the cool, damp stone of the cellar wall. The cellar itself was unexpectedly refined, soft, wall-to-wall carpeting, and strategically placed lighting that dispelled the anticipated gloom. A massive, high-definition television dominated one wall, flanked by oversized, leather armchairs. A polished billiards table stood in a corner, seemingly untouched. It screamed of affluence, of a deliberate attempt to create a sanctuary of leisure. But the origin of the persistent hum wasn't any of these opulent distractions. It emanated from behind a large, ornate bookcase, tucked discreetly in the furthest corner. As I approached, a sliver of light, barely visible, bled from behind the bookcase. My heart quickened, a mixture of apprehension and intrigue swirling within me. I ran my fingers along the bookcase's edge, searching for a latch, a switch, anything. My questing fingers discovered a subtly recessed panel. I pressed it, and with a muted click, the bookcase swung inward, revealing a door, standing slightly ajar. The hum, now unmistakably mechanical, resonated clearly from within. I hesitated, the rational part of my mind warring with the burgeoning curiosity. This was an invasion of privacy. I had no right, but the unknown beckoned, a siren's call promising revelations. I eased the door open. The room beyond was compact, perhaps a mere 12 feet square. The walls were lined with an array of computer screens, each displaying a different video feed. Some were instantly recognizable. The Du Bois front garden, the elegant dining room, even Mr. Du Bois' own bedroom. Others were utterly unfamiliar. Nondescript office buildings, darkened parking lots, the interiors of other equally grand homes. In the center of this clandestine command center stood a desk, its surface littered with documents and photographs. A sleek laptop sat open, its screen displaying cascading lines of complex code. This was the source of the hum, its internal fan working furiously to dissipate the heat generated by its intense activity. My breath caught in my throat as I approached the desk, a growing unease settling in the pit of my stomach. The photographs scattered across the surface were a perplexing jumble of surveillance shots and more personal images. I recognized Arthur in many of them, but he seemed different. A harder edge to his features, a certain intensity one hadn't witnessed before. Some showed him conferring with individuals in tailored suits, in settings that suggested clandestine meetings. Others depicted him handling what appeared to be substantial amounts of currency. The documents were even more disquieting. detailed financial records, transcripts of what seemed to be intercepted phone calls, meticulously compiled schedules outlining the daily routines of various individuals. None of it coalesced into a coherent narrative, yet my intuition, now screaming at full volume, told me this was far from benign. I picked up one of the photographs, my hand trembling almost uncontrollably. It depicted Arthur shaking hands with a man whose face was vaguely familiar. Then it clicked, a local entrepreneur who had been splashed across the headlines several months prior, implicated in a massive embezzlement scheme. The sudden sound of a car door slamming outside sent a jolt of pure terror through me. I dropped the photograph, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Footsteps approached the front door. Keys jangled. They were home, prematurely. Panic seized me. I had to escape, to erase any trace of my intrusion. I rushed out of the hidden room, pulling the door shut behind me. The bookcase swung silently back into place with a soft, almost mocking click. I raced up the cellar stairs, taking them two at a time, my lungs burning, my legs aching. I could hear voices now, Arthur and Mr. Dubois, in the entryway. I burst into the living room, diving for the sofa where I'd left my book, my heart pounding a frantic tattoo against my ribs. The front door opened just as I'd arranged myself on the sofa, the book open on my lap, feigning an air of studious calm. Eleanor, Arthur's voice, sounding deceptively cheerful, rang out. "You're still here. Father mentioned he wasn't feeling well." I looked up, forcing a smile, praying it didn't betray the sheer terror coursing through me. "Yes, he seemed a bit tired. He's already asleep." Arthur nodded, his gaze sweeping over me. For a fleeting, heart-stopping moment, I thought I detected a flicker of suspicion in his eyes, a subtle tightening of his jaw. But it vanished so quickly, I dismissed it as a figment of my overactive imagination. "Thank you for staying late," he said, his voice now laced with that familiar, practiced warmth. "We were unexpectedly detained at a charity gala." I nodded, gathering my belongings, every movement feeling exaggerated, unnatural, as if my body was rebelling against my attempts at normalcy. Of course, no problem at all. As I reached the door, Arthur handed me my payment, a crisp $100 bill. "Will we see you next Wednesday?" he asked. The question hung in the air, a seemingly innocuous inquiry that now felt laden with menace. Could I return, knowing what I knew? Refusing would undoubtedly arouse suspicion. "Certainly," I replied, plastering on another forced smile. "Have a good night." The cool night air, a stark contrast to the stifling atmosphere of the house, hit me as I stepped outside. I inhaled deeply, trying to calm my racing heart. My car was parked at the curb, and I forced myself to walk towards it at a normal pace, resisting the overwhelming urge to sprint. "Don't run," I told myself. "Act natural." Once inside, I locked the doors and sat there, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. My mind was a maelstrom of confusion and fear, struggling to reconcile the seemingly ordinary Dubois family with the unsettling discoveries I'd made in their cellar. Who were they, truly? What clandestine activities were they involved in? I started the engine, desperate to put distance between myself and that house, that unsettling secret. As I pulled away from the curb, I glanced in my rearview mirror. Arthur stood in the doorway, illuminated by the porch light, watching me depart. The shadows cast across his face transformed him into a stranger, a figure of menace and uncertainty. I drove home in a daze, my thoughts a chaotic jumble of unanswered questions. What was I going to do with this knowledge? Go to the authorities? But with what concrete evidence? My word, the word of a part-time caregiver, against a wealthy, respected family, seemed ludicrous. When I arrived at my small apartment, I double-checked all the locks, a primal fear taking root within me. I knew I was being irrational, but the feeling of being watched, of being vulnerable, was overwhelming. I sank onto my bed, hugging a pillow to my chest, trying to think rationally. Perhaps there was a perfectly innocent explanation. Maybe Arthur was some sort of undercover agent, and this was all related to his work. But deep down, I knew that was wishful thinking. The cash, the surreptitious meetings, the extensive surveillance, it all pointed to something far more sinister. Sleep eluded me that night. I tossed and turned, haunted by images of hidden rooms, shadowy figures, and the unsettling gaze of Arthur Du Bois. By morning, I'd reached a decision. I couldn't return to that house. I call Arthur, fabricate some excuse about a family emergency, anything to avoid stepping back into that web of secrets. But as I reached for my phone, it buzzed with an incoming text message. My blood ran cold as I read the words, sent from an unknown number. Enjoying your little discoveries, Eleanor? Let's discuss them. Come to the bakery at 3 p.m. Come alone, or your family might suffer a similar fate. I have ways of finding out who they are. My hands trembled so violently I nearly dropped the phone. They knew. Somehow they knew I'd been in that room. Had they installed hidden cameras I'd failed to detect? Or had I inadvertently left some telltale sign of my presence? I considered fleeing, packing a bag, and disappearing. But the chilling threat hung heavy in the air. Your family. They knew who I was. They knew where to find me. They were capable of anything. I glanced at the clock.
11 Uhr morgens.
For hours. For hours until I had to confront whatever awaited me at the bakery. For hours to devise a plan, a strategy, any means of extricating myself from this rapidly escalating nightmare. As I sat there, my mind frantically cycling through possibilities, one chilling certainty solidified. My life, the life I'd known, was irrevocably altered. Whatever transpired at 3 p.m., I would be stepping into a world I had never sought, a world of shadows and peril, a world from which I might never fully emerge. The innocent Wednesday evening, when I'd simply arrived to care for an elderly man, felt like a distant memory. Now, I was ensnared in a web of my own curiosities making, with no clear path to safety. I looked out my window at the bustling street below, at people going about their ordinary lives, oblivious to the terror that had taken root within me. How I envied their normalcy, their blissful ignorance, because I knew that in a few short hours, I would be facing the consequences of uncovering a truth that was never meant to be revealed. And I had no idea if I would survive the encounter, the ranger's perilous pursuit, the eerie silence of the forest, usually a balm to my soul, transformed into a suffocating blanket of dread the moment I heard the distant, muffled voices. My routine patrol, intended to be a peaceful survey of Whispering Pines National Park, had just veered sharply into the realm of the perilous. I, Ranger William Will Harding, a guardian of these woods for over 15 years, had always prided myself on knowing every trail, every hidden hollow. Tonight, however, the forest felt alien. Harboring secrets it was reluctant to yield. It was a crisp October evening, the kind that painted the leaves in fiery hues and filled the air with the scent of decaying wood and damp earth. The moon, a sliver shy of full, cast an ethereal glow through the dense canopy, creating a shifting tapestry of light and shadow. I'd been on edge for weeks. Reports of illegal hunting had been on the rise, and several mutilated animal carcasses had been discovered, stripped of their valuable parts. Catching poachers in this vast wilderness was akin to locating a single, specific grain of sand on a boundless beach. I'd been traversing my designated route for several hours, the silence broken only by the rhythmic crunch of my boots on the leaf-strewn path, when the first hint of something amiss reached my ears. A low, indistinct murmur, barely audible above the whisper of the wind through the pines. I halted, every sense on high alert, straining to decipher the sound. There it was again, undeniably human voices, and undeniably out of place at this late hour. My pulse quickened as I cautiously advanced towards the source, keeping to the shadows, my hand instinctively resting on the reassuring weight of my service weapon. As I drew closer, the voices grew more distinct, revealing themselves as male, speaking in hushed, excited tones. The metallic click of what could only be firearms being handled sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I crept to the edge of a small clearing, and the scene that unfolded before me sent a wave of nausea through me. For men, clad in camouflage gear, were gathered around the carcass of a magnificent buck, its antlers a testament to its former glory. High-powered rifles leaned against nearby trees, and the glint of hunting knives reflected the moonlight with a menacing sheen. This wasn't mere poaching. This was a blatant, organized disregard for the law, a desecration of the very wilderness I was sworn to protect. I considered my options. Radioing for backup was the standard procedure, but I knew the nearest ranger station was at least an hour away, even by the fastest route. By the time assistance arrived, these men would be long gone, vanished into the vast expanse of the forest. I had to act, and I had to act now. Taking a deep breath, I stepped into the clearing, my voice amplified by the natural acoustics of the space. "State Park Rangers," I announced, striving for an authority I wasn't entirely feeling. "Drop your weapons and place your hands where I can see them." For a heartbeat, everything froze. The men caught in the act seemed momentarily paralyzed. Then chaos erupted. Two of the men instantly reached for their rifles, their movements honed by practice. Another, a burly individual with a face obscured by a thick, unkempt beard, lunged towards me, a hunting knife flashing in his hand. I sidestepped his clumsy attack, drawing my sidearm in a single, fluid motion. "Stop right there," I commanded, my voice echoing through the stillness. I said, "Drop your weapons." The bearded man hesitated, his eyes narrowed, assessing the situation. But the others were less inclined to comply. One of them, a younger man with a nervous twitch, leveled his rifle at me. "You're outnumbered, Ranger," he sneered, his voice trembling slightly. "Just walk away. Pretend you didn't see anything." I stood my ground, my weapon trained on him, acutely aware of the precariousness of my position. I was one man against four, armed and desperate. "Can't do that," I replied, my voice surprisingly steady. "You're all under arrest." The bearded man's eyes flickered with something akin to amusement. "Have it your way," he said, and fired. The shot went wide, the bullet embedding itself in the trunk of a nearby tree with a sickening thud. I dove for cover behind a massive, moss-covered boulder, my heart hammering against my ribs. This was no longer a simple arrest. This was a firefight. I could hear them moving, spreading out, attempting to flank me. I risked a quick glance around the edge of the boulder and instantly regretted it. Another shot rang out, the bullet ricocheting off the rock face mere inches from my head. "Come on out, Ranger," one of them called, his voice mocking. "We just want to have a little chat." "Yeah, right," I muttered under my breath. I knew that if I exposed myself, I'd be dead in seconds. These men had too much to lose to leave any witnesses. I fumbled for my radio, keeping my weapon trained on the direction of their voices. "This is Ranger Harding," I whispered urgently. "Sector 4, requesting immediate backup. Armed poachers. Shots fired." I repeat, shots fired. Static. Only static. I was either too deep in the woods for a signal to penetrate, or they were employing some sort of jamming device. Either way, I was on my own. A twig snapped to my left, and I whirled, firing off a warning shot. "Stay back," I shouted. "The next one won't miss." Laughter, cruel and mocking, echoed through the trees. "Big words for a man hiding behind a rock," one of them taunted. I gritted my teeth, frustration and fear warring within me. I couldn't remain pinned down indefinitely, but making a run for it would be suicide. I needed a plan, a desperate gambit that might just give me a fighting chance. My gaze fell upon the buck carcass, still lying in the center of the clearing. An idea, born of desperation, began to form in my mind. It was risky, bordering on insane, but it might be my only option. Keeping low, I shrugged off my heavy ranger jacket. I began stuffing it with leaves, pine needles, anything I could find to give it some semblance of human form. It wasn't much, but in the darkness, it might just pass as a convincing decoy, at least for a few crucial seconds. "All right," I yelled, trying to project an air of defeat. "I'm coming out. Don't shoot." I heard them shuffling, their weapons readied. "Hands where we can see them," one of them barked. Slowly, I raised my makeshift dummy above the boulder with one hand, while I remained concealed behind the rock. I said, "Hands up." I lifted the dummy higher, then, with a sudden, violent motion, flung it to the side. As I'd hoped, they fell for it. Multiple shots rang out, shredding my jacket to ribbons. In that moment of distraction, I sprang into action. I sprinted towards the buck carcass, diving behind it just as they realized their mistake. Bullets whizzed overhead, but the bulk of the animal provided significantly better cover than the boulder had. Now for phase 2 of my increasingly improbable plan. I took careful aim at the buck's distended stomach and fired. The carcass exploded, releasing a stench so foul, so overpowering, it made my eyes water. I heard retching and cursing from the poachers, their momentary disorientation giving me a precious few seconds. Using the cover of the nauseating cloud, I made a break for the tree line. I crashed through the underbrush, branches tearing at my face and arms, my lungs burning, my legs screaming in protest. I could hear them behind me, but the head start and the lingering stench had given me a slight advantage. I ran like I'd never run before, weaving through the trees, my intimate knowledge of the terrain my only ally. My lungs felt like they were on fire, and a sharp pain in my side threatened to cripple me, but I didn't dare slow down. I knew these woods, but so did they. My only hope was to reach my patrol vehicle before they caught up. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a matter of minutes, I burst out of the tree line onto the narrow dirt road where I'd parked. My Jeep, a symbol of safety and escape, sat there, bathed in the pale moonlight. Just as I reached for the door handle, a shot rang out. Pain exploded in my left shoulder, and I stumbled, crying out. I turned to see the bearded man emerging from the woods, his rifle leveled at me. "End of the line, Ranger," he said, a cruel smile twisting his lips. I leaned against the Jeep, my injured arm hanging uselessly at my side, blood soaking through my shirt. The pain was intense, making it difficult to think clearly. But I wasn't finished yet. "You're right," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. "It is the end of the line for you." His brow furrowed in confusion. Then, his eyes widened as he heard what I'd been desperately praying for. The distant, yet unmistakable wail of sirens. In that moment of distraction, I lunged forward, tackling him to the ground. We grappled in the dirt, both of us fighting for control of the rifle. Despite the searing pain in my shoulder, adrenaline surged through me, granting me a burst of strength. I managed to wrench the weapon from his grasp and bring the butt of it down hard on his head. He went limp beneath me. I staggered to my feet, the rifle clutched in my good hand, just as several patrol cars screeched to a halt, their headlights illuminating the scene in a blaze of red and blue. The cavalry finally had arrived. The next few hours passed in a haze of activity. The other poachers were apprehended. My wound was treated, and I gave countless statements. By the time the sun rose, casting a golden glow over the forest, it was all over. As I sat on the tailgate of an ambulance, wrapped in a shock blanket, my superior officer, Captain Miller, approached. He looked at me with a mixture of pride and concern. "You did good, Will," he said, placing a hand on my uninjured shoulder. "Those guys were part of a network we've been tracking for months. You just took down a major operation." I nodded, too exhausted to feel much beyond relief that I was still alive. "Get some rest," he continued, "and when you're back on your feet, well, let's just say there might be a commendation in your future." As he walked away, I gazed out at the forest, the same trees that had been a battleground just hours before now looking serene in the morning light. I knew I'd never look at these woods the same way again, but I also knew that I'd be back. This forest was my responsibility, my home, and I'd almost died protecting it. If anything, this ordeal had only strengthened my resolve. There would be other threats, other challenges. And I'd be here standing guard, because that's what rangers do. We protect the wild, the vulnerable, the things that can't protect themselves, no matter the cost. I climbed into the ambulance, wincing as the movement jarred my injured shoulder. As we pulled away, I took one last look at the vast expanse of green stretching out behind us. Yeah, I'd be back. These woods hadn't seen the last of Ranger Will Harding. Not by a long shot. The babysitter's bewilderment. I've never really experienced anything truly frightening in my life. Awkward moments? Certainly. Instances of outright meanness from others? Those too. But never anything legitimately terrifying. However, all that changed a few weeks prior to the pandemic lockdown, when I was unexpectedly asked to babysit a neighbor's child while they attended a social function related to their employment. I had absolutely zero prior experience in babysitting. Admittedly, I was incredibly apprehensive. Had I possessed even the faintest inkling of the bewildering night that awaited me, I would have unequivocally declined the proposition. The situation was further exacerbated by my parents, who emphatically assured me that it would be an easy $50 and that the evening would conclude before I even realized it had begun. From the very outset, a pervasive sense of foreboding clung to me, a nagging premonition that something was amiss. However, my father, with his characteristic optimism, managed to dissuade me, convincing me that my anxieties were unfounded. Now, in retrospect, I profoundly regret not trusting my instincts and steering clear of the entire situation. So, I ambled over to the neighbor's house around 7 in the evening, introducing myself to the parents, Mr. and Mrs. Hamilton, and their young son, Ethan, before they meticulously outlined a few fundamental ground rules. Initially, it appeared that my father's assessment had been accurate, that my apprehension had been entirely misplaced, and that, if I navigated the situation adroitly, I could potentially transform this into a regular, lucrative endeavor, funding my weekend shopping sprees. The Hamiltons were undeniably charming, and Ethan, at first, seemed equally delightful. Consequently, I rapidly relaxed, even beginning to derive a degree of enjoyment from the task of entertaining the young boy, aided, in no small part, by the availability of Disney Plus, of which, I confess, I am an ardent admirer. Everything proceeded smoothly, harmoniously even, until the dreaded hour of bedtime arrived. It was then that the situation began to unravel, taking a decidedly awkward turn. Ethan, with the unwavering obstinacy characteristic of his age, flatly refused to retire for the night. Our newfound, amicable rapport swiftly deteriorated, replaced by an escalating conflict. I felt an overwhelming sense of guilt, having to impose my authority upon the child. He transitioned with alarming rapidity from tears and whimpers to unrestrained shouts and screams, directing his ire at me with the unrestrained fury of a betrayed friend. He declared that I wasn't his mother, that he harbored a profound dislike for me, and that I had no right to be there. His words, surprisingly, stung, and it dawned on me that perhaps I wasn't quite prepared for this level of responsibility. To be a parent or a guardian, one requires a certain fortitude, a resilience that enables one to, in a sense, embrace the role of the bad guy, if that makes any sense. And if any of you are contemplating venturing into the realm of babysitting, lured by the prospect of effortless financial gain, I implore you to reconsider. I have subsequently engaged in far simpler tasks for monetary compensation, tasks that don't leave you burdened with the remorse of having to reprimand a child. However, after a protracted period, the sheer intensity of his tantrum seemed to exhaust Ethan. And although he still visibly harbored resentment towards me, he reluctantly ascended to his room, donned his pajamas, and climbed into bed, ostensibly to sleep. He requested that I read him a bedtime story, and given that he had, at last, complied with my instructions, I obliged. When his eyelids finally fluttered shut, and his breathing slowed to a gentle, rhythmic cadence, I stealthily exited the room, descending the stairs to leave him to his slumber. About an hour or so later, I was ensconced on the sofa, engrossed in a text message exchange with a friend, recounting the unexpected challenges of babysitting, which far exceeded my initial expectations. I was consuming the remnants of a chicken pot pie, a culinary offering from my mother, intended for my sustenance during the evening, while simultaneously catching up on episodes of The Mandalorian, when the family's landline telephone suddenly erupted into a shrill, insistent ring. Assuming it was the Hamiltons, conducting a routine checkup, I answered the call, greeting the caller with the most cheerful, effervescent tone I could muster. However, there was no response from the other end, only an unnerving silence. I repeated my greeting several times, eventually concluding that it was either an accidental pocket dial or a faulty connection. I terminated the call and returned to my meal, my attention once again drawn to the flickering images on the television screen. No sooner had I resumed my seated position than the telephone rang again, its jarring clamor shattering the tranquility. I was, I suppose, anticipating it. Perhaps the Hamiltons had driven through a tunnel, momentarily losing signal. I truly didn't know. Regardless, I rose once more, approached the telephone, and lifted the receiver. This time, however, I distinctly heard breathing on the other end of the line, a slow, deliberate inhalation and exhalation. I offered another cheerful hello, but the breathing persisted, unaccompanied by any verbal response. When the person finally spoke, it was in a deep, resonant voice, unmistakably male, instructing me, in a strangely distorted tone, to check on the sleeping kid. I momentarily entertained the notion that it might be Ethan's father, engaging in some ill-conceived prank. However, there was something undeniably unsettling about the voice, something that sent a shiver of apprehension down my spine. I responded with a hesitant, "Okay, I'll go check," and the line went dead, abruptly and decisively. I ascended the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest, and entered Ethan's room. He was, indeed, asleep, his small form nestled beneath the covers, his breathing slow and regular. As much as I was unnerved by the peculiar voice, I rationalized that it must have been Mr. Hamilton, perhaps following an argument with his wife. I truly didn't know, and I consciously attempted to suppress any further speculation. However, almost as soon as I returned downstairs, the telephone rang yet again. No caller ID, no identifying information whatsoever. I answered, unable to entirely conceal the tremor of fear that had crept into my voice. This, I realized, was a grave error. Whoever was on the other end sensed my vulnerability and responded with a chilling, low giggle, delivered in that same, unsettlingly distorted voice. What they uttered next caused my blood to run cold. "Gonna snatch him up. Gonna snatch up the little tyke. When you're not looking, gonna get him." I was rendered speechless, paralyzed by a surge of pure, unadulterated terror. And it was then, in that moment of suffocating silence, that I heard it, a distinct creak in the floorboards above me. Someone was moving, stealthily, in the rooms upstairs. I practically dropped the telephone, propelled by a surge of adrenaline, and bolted upstairs, rushing into Ethan's room. He was still asleep, or rather, he appeared to be asleep. But that same deep, slow breathing, the one I had heard on the telephone, was absent. The more I observed him, the more it seemed as though he was deliberately holding his breath. Furthermore, his arm was positioned at an unnatural angle, suggesting that he was clutching something beneath his pillow, something he was attempting to conceal. In a frenzy of suspicion, I lifted the pillow slightly, revealing the unsettling truth. Whoever had deemed it appropriate to purchase an 8-year-old child a mobile phone was, in my estimation, utterly deranged. But beneath that pillow wasn't merely a phone. There was also some kind of voice-altering device. I seized both items and fled the room, descending the stairs once more, where Ethan, predictably, erupted into another furious tantrum. I felt an overwhelming sense of foolishness, completely outmaneuvered by a child, manipulated into a state of fear and vulnerability. How could someone so young possess such a capacity for malice and deceit? The Hamiltons arrived home shortly thereafter, and I refrained from mentioning the incident until they had compensated me in full. Then, and only then, did I unleash my pent-up frustration, delivering a scathing rebuke. I declared that I would never babysit for them again, that they were demonstrably irresponsible for permitting their child to possess such devices, particularly a voice changer. It transpired that the creepy gadget belonged to their older, college-aged son, and that Ethan had become fascinated with it, refusing to return it. But I didn't care. I had no intention of ever subjecting myself to such an ordeal again. The Scalpel's Serenade. Allow me to preface this account with a brief explanation of my sleep patterns. I am a lucid dreamer. By this, I mean that I am capable of making conscious decisions within my dreams, and I retain vivid recollections of these nocturnal adventures upon awakening. However, I am not always aware that I am, in fact, dreaming, particularly when the dreams themselves are exceptionally realistic. Consequently, my nightmares become exponentially more terrifying. One particular nightmare, experienced several years ago, was so intensely surreal that it continues to evoke a visceral cringe whenever it resurfaces in my memory. It's difficult to recall with absolute precision, given the passage of time, but it undeniably ranks among the most harrowing nightmares I have ever endured. It commenced within the familiar confines of my own home. I remember experiencing a profound sense of unease, akin to the apprehension one might feel before boarding an aircraft for the first time, burdened by a crippling fear of heights. Then, piercing the unsettling silence, came the screams, blood-curdling screams emanating from the other rooms of my house, from my mother's bedroom, from my sister's sanctuary. I exited my room, driven by a desperate need to ascertain the source of the commotion. My house was a two-story dwelling, comprising 3 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms. All the bedrooms were situated on the upper floor, with mine being the closest to the staircase. Almost simultaneously with my emergence from my room, I witnessed a man, a complete stranger, exiting my mother's bedroom. He turned his gaze upon me, and I observed that his face was utterly devoid of emotion, a blank canvas devoid of any discernible expression. Before I could register any further details about his appearance, my surroundings underwent a dramatic, disorienting transformation. I found myself transported to a dimly lit street, the man barely visible in the sporadic pools of illumination cast by the streetlights. As he stepped into one of these illuminated patches, I finally noticed the glint of metal in his hand, a scalpel. His face was speckled, marred by droplets of what I instantly recognized as blood. A wave of icy terror washed over me, engulfing my entire being. I spent the next 3 hours, or what felt like 3 hours within the distorted temporal framework of the dream, engaged in a desperate, relentless flight from this menacing figure. I hid from him, I sought refuge in the shadows, I pounded frantically on the doors of vacant homes, pleading for assistance. But he always knew my location. He invariably caught up to me. For some inexplicable reason, I was significantly slower in my dream, my movements sluggish and hampered. I was utterly incapable of escaping his relentless pursuit. As a stark example, I might conceal myself within a dense thicket of bushes or behind a sturdy brick wall. He would, without fail, stride directly towards my hiding place, his gaze fixed upon me with unnerving precision. Invariably, I would manage a fleeting escape before he could reach me, scrambling away in a desperate bid for survival. He did not possess a direct line of sight, yet he consistently managed to locate me. I could continue running, that was my sole recourse. But hiding was futile. I was utterly incapable of concealing myself from this relentless pursuer. The most chilling, most profoundly disturbing aspect of this entire ordeal was that, after countless failed attempts at escape, after the dream refused to shift or conclude, I succumbed to despair. I abandoned my futile flight. As he finally apprehended me, a faint, almost imperceptible smile, devoid of any genuine emotion, played upon his lips. He grasped the scalpel, its cold, metallic surface gleaming ominously in the dim light, and I can still, with sickening clarity, remember the sensation of that blade slicing across my neck. In stark contrast to the abject terror I had endured for what felt like an eternity, I experienced a sudden, unexpected surge of tranquility, a profound sense of peace. I felt the warmth of my own blood trickling down my neck. I saw my hands stained crimson. I remember closing my eyes, and in the very next instant, I awoke, my body drenched in a cold sweat, my heart hammering against my ribs, my mind reeling from the sheer intensity of the experience. I realized, with a sickening jolt, that I had just experienced a lucid dream in which I had been murdered. Sleep eluded me for the remainder of that night. The necklace of ill omen. The moment I fastened the clasp of the antique locket around my neck, I felt a subtle shift, a premonition of impending change. It was a beautiful piece, intricately crafted and seemingly innocuous, but I would soon learn that some treasures are best left undisturbed. This seemingly harmless trinket was about to unravel my carefully constructed life and plunge me into a world of peril and intrigue. My name is Isabella Rossi, and until recently, my existence was decidedly ordinary. A 32-year-old archivist, I lived a quiet life in a modest apartment in the city, surrounded by books, my faithful tabby cat, Oliver, and a small circle of friends. My passion lay in the past, in the dusty pages of forgotten manuscripts and the whispered stories of bygone eras. It was this passion that led me to the fateful online auction. I'd been browsing a website specializing in antique jewelry, searching for a unique piece to add to my small collection. That's when I saw it. A stunning Art Nouveau locket, featuring a delicate silver filigree design and a mesmerizing, deep emerald gemstone that seemed to shimmer even in the low-resolution photograph. The seller, a woman named Beatrice, had listed it with a surprisingly affordable, buy-it-now price. Without a second thought, I clicked the button, sealing my fate. Beatrice and I arranged to meet at a local coffee shop the following afternoon. She was older than I'd expected, perhaps in her late 50s, with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor. There was a hint of melancholy in her voice as we exchanged pleasantries. "This locket has been in my family for generations," she explained, carefully handing me the delicate piece. "It's brought us a mixed legacy. I hope it brings you more joy than it brought us." I assured her I would cherish it, paid for the locket, and we parted ways. As I walked home, I couldn't resist putting it on. The cool weight of it against my skin felt strangely comforting, as if it belonged there. That evening, I wore the locket to a gallery opening with my friend, Clara. The compliments were immediate and effusive, and I basked in the unexpected attention. It wasn't until I was walking home, the city streets hushed and deserted, that the first unsettling feeling crept over me, the distinct sensation of being observed. I quickened my pace, glancing over my shoulder, but saw only empty sidewalks and the flickering glow of street lamps. Still, the unease persisted, a prickling at the back of my neck. By the time I reached my apartment building, I was practically running. I double-checked the locks that night, Oliver curled up at my feet, a purring ball of reassurance. I chalked it up to nerves, to the inherent vulnerability of being a woman alone in the city. The next morning, everything seemed normal again. I got ready for work, pausing to admire the locket in the mirror. It truly did elevate even the simplest outfit. It was during my lunch break, while scrolling through social media, that the first tangible sign of trouble appeared. A private message from an unknown account. "That locket suits you, but it doesn't belong to you." I froze, my heart skipping a beat. I looked around the crowded office, but everyone was engrossed in their own tasks, oblivious to the sudden turmoil that had erupted within me. With trembling fingers, I typed a reply, "Who is this?" The response came almost instantaneously. "Someone who knows the truth about that locket. Someone who wants it back." I put my phone down, my appetite gone. It had to be a prank, a case of mistaken identity. But the knot of dread in my stomach tightened with each passing minute. That evening, I found myself constantly touching the locket, the smooth metal now feeling cold and alien against my skin. I was about to go to bed when I heard it, a soft, persistent tapping at my apartment door. Oliver, usually placid, arched his back, his fur on end, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "Hello," I called out, my voice wavering slightly. No answer, just the continued tapping, now accompanied by a faint scratching sound. I approached the door on tiptoe, my heart hammering. The peephole revealed nothing. An empty hallway. I don't know what compelled me, perhaps a foolish sense of bravado, but I opened the door. There, on my doormat, lay a single white lily, its petals bruised and wilting, and a small, folded piece of paper. The note, written in elegant, spidery script, read, "It was hers first. We are coming for it." I slammed the door shut, locked it, and slid down to the floor, my back against the cold wood, Oliver winding around my legs, a small, warm comfort in the face of encroaching terror. What had Beatrice gotten me into? Sleep was impossible that night. Every creak of the building, every distant siren, sent shivers of fear through me. By morning, I was a nervous wreck. I needed answers, and I knew only one person who might provide them. I tried calling Beatrice, but the number was disconnected. Frantic, I decided to return to the coffee shop where we'd met, hoping the staff might remember her, might have some contact information. As I approached the cafe, I saw her. Beatrice was sitting at an outdoor table, her face pale and drawn. Relief flooded through me, quickly followed by alarm. "Beatrice," I called out, rushing towards her. She looked up, her eyes widening in fear. Before I could reach her, a man appeared, seemingly materializing from thin air. He grabbed Beatrice's arm, his grip tight and possessive. "Inside, now," he hissed, his voice a low growl, loud enough for me to hear. They disappeared into the cafe, just as I reached the table. I burst through the door after them, but they were gone. The barista, a young man with a bored expression, looked at me quizzically. "The couple who just came in," I panted. "Where did they go?" He shrugged. "Didn't see anyone come in, Mississippi." I knew what I'd seen. I wasn't imagining things. Shaken and desperate, I left the cafe, my hand instinctively going to the locket, now feeling like a lead weight around my neck. Over the next few days, the harassment escalated. More cryptic messages from unknown numbers. Unmarked packages delivered to my office, containing old photographs of the locket being worn by different women, their faces obscured. A shadowy figure lurking in the alleyway behind my apartment building. I was a nervous wreck, jumping at every shadow, unable to sleep, unable to concentrate. I considered going to the police, but what could I tell them? That I was being stalked because of a locket I'd bought online? They'd dismiss me as delusional. I tried to distract myself with work, burying myself in the comforting familiarity of ancient texts, but it was no use. My colleagues noticed, their concern evident in their hushed whispers and worried glances. I brushed off their inquiries with vague excuses, feigning illness, anything to avoid revealing the terrifying truth. It was Friday evening when the situation reached its breaking point. A sudden noise from the hallway made me jump. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching my office. My heart hammered against my ribs as I watched the door handle slowly turn. The door creaked open, revealing a man I'd never seen before, tall and imposing, with sharp features and eyes that seemed to pierce through me. He was holding a small, antique pistol. "The locket," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Give it to me." I stood up, my legs trembling, placing the desk between us. "Who are you? What do you want?" He smiled, a chilling, predatory expression. "My name is Julian, and I want what rightfully belongs to my family." He took a step closer, and I edged towards the window. "The locket isn't yours," I stammered. "I bought it fair and square." Julian chuckled, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. "Fair and square? My dear girl, nothing about this is fair. That locket has a history, a dark and bloody one. It's brought nothing but misery to those who've possessed it. And now, it's time for it to return to its rightful owners." As he spoke, he gestured with the pistol, motioning for me to remove the locket. My fingers fumbled with the clasp, the metal now feeling burning hot against my skin. Just then, the office door burst open again. Beatrice rushed in, her face streaked with tears. "Isabella, don't!" she cried. Julian whirled, his pistol now trained on Beatrice. You, he snarled. I should have known you'd interfere. Beatrice's eyes darted between Julian and me. Isabella, listen to me. The locket, it's not just jewelry. It's a key to something ancient, something powerful, something that should never be unleashed. Julian's face contorted with rage. Shut up, he shouted, his composure finally cracking. In that moment of distraction, I acted. I grabbed the heavy brass bookend from my desk and hurled it at Julian with all my might. It struck him squarely on the head. He staggered, dropping the pistol, and collapsed to the floor, unconscious. Beatrice rushed to my side, her hands trembling. Are you all right? I nodded, still reeling from the adrenaline surge. What's going on, Beatrice? What is this locket? She sighed, her shoulders slumping with the weight of a long-held secret. It's a long story, one that spans centuries. That locket is the key to a hidden vault, a repository of ancient artifacts, imbued with powers beyond our comprehension. Julian's family, a secret society known as the Keepers, have been searching for it for generations. They believe it will grant them ultimate power. I stared at her, my mind struggling to grasp the enormity of her words. And you tried to hide it. Beatrice nodded, her eyes filled with remorse. I thought if I sold it to someone ordinary, someone outside their reach, it would be safe. I was wrong. I'm so sorry, Isabella. I never meant for you to get caught up in this. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of her revelation pressing down on us. Finally, I stood up, my resolve hardening. So, what do we do now? Beatrice looked at me, a flicker of hope in her eyes. Now, we find the vault before they do, and we make sure whatever's inside never falls into the wrong hands. As we left the office, the locket seemed to pulse with a faint, almost imperceptible energy against my skin. I realized that my life, my quiet, predictable life, was gone forever. In its place was a world of ancient secrets, hidden dangers, and a responsibility I never asked for. And somehow I, Isabella Rossi, the unassuming archivist, was now at the heart of it all, because of a locket I'd impulsively purchased online. Life, I thought Riley had a truly twisted sense of humor. But as terrifying as it was, a part of me, the part that had always yearned for adventure, for something beyond the mundane, felt a surge of exhilaration. With Beatrice by my side and a target on my back, I stepped out into the night, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. After all, I had a vault to find, the phantom caller of the backwoods. Allow me to provide some contextual information about myself. I am an 18-year-old male. I was 17 at the time of this unsettling incident. I've had my share of peculiar occurrences throughout my life, but nothing has ever quite surpassed this one, and I sincerely hope nothing ever will. My parents were hosting a social gathering at our residence, a get-together that, to my perception, seemed to be winding down. Boredom began to set in, and it was at this precise moment that I received a text message from one of my close companions, Lucas. He extended an invitation for me to join him at his home. I readily accepted, replying with a swift sure. He informed me that our other friends, Caleb, Ryan, and Matthew, were also present, eagerly awaiting my arrival. I responded that I would be there in approximately 10 minutes. Upon my arrival, I entered Lucas's house and found it strangely deserted. I conducted a thorough search of the premises, locating everyone except Lucas himself. I repeatedly inquired about his whereabouts, only to be met with the frustratingly vague directive to go find him. I initially assumed they were engaging in some sort of playful prank, so I decided to humor them, embarking on a search. To properly understand the subsequent events, I must provide a brief description of Lucas's property. He resides in a house with a relatively elongated driveway, featuring several curves, with a barn situated on one side and his driveway on the opposite. The house itself is largely surrounded by dense woodlands and expansive fields. I continued my search around the house for a considerable period, until they finally informed me that Lucas was, in fact, inside the barn. I proceeded outdoors, heading towards the barn. Upon entering, I was met with an unnerving silence. I called out Lucas's name, but there was no response. I decided to abandon my search, just as my phone began to ring. It was Lucas. I answered, exclaiming, "Dude, where are you?" He replied, his voice tinged with a hint of urgency. "I'm running through the backwoods. You have to come find me." I hung up, a sense of dread creeping over me as I contemplated the prospect of traversing the woods. Why would he venture back there? Pondered. It's dark, it's cold, and it's practically a swamp. My phone rang again. It was Lucas once more. I inquired as to why he had gone back there. He simply reiterated his plea, urging me to come to the tree line. Something sounded distinctly off about his voice, a subtle inflection that I couldn't quite place, but I dismissed it as mere paranoia. I informed him that I was on my way and began my trek through the soggy, treacherous field. That's when I received yet another phone call. This time it was Ryan. "Dude, where are you?" he asked. "Did you leave? We're looking for you." I informed him that I was en route to retrieve Lucas. What he said next caused my heart to plummet into the pit of my stomach. He stated unequivocally that Lucas was standing right beside him. My mind raced. I questioned him, demanding to know why Lucas had called me, claiming to be stranded in the woods. Ryan informed me with a chilling calmness that Lucas was, in fact, in the garage and that his phone battery was completely depleted. A wave of nausea washed over me as he delivered this revelation. I sprinted back towards the house with a speed I didn't know I possessed. Upon my return, Lucas had managed to charge his phone, and he showed me, with a bewildered expression, that there were no recent outgoing calls logged. To this day, I have absolutely no idea who contacted me that night or why they attempted to lure me into the dark, foreboding woods, the unsettling shadow of downtown. Late last autumn, a significant milestone arrived, my 21st birthday. Naturally, celebrations with my closest friends were in order, but my boyfriend, Ethan's mother, a woman of considerable warmth and generosity, insisted on treating me to a separate outing. She went ahead and secured a reservation at a rather fashionable bar in the downtown district, a plan set for Saturday evening. Saturday night finally materialized, but as fate would have it, the city was engulfed in a truly epic traffic jam. Ethan's mother, whom I'll refer to as Mrs. Davies, and I managed to find parking in a toll lot, a considerable distance from our destination. This necessitated a walk of approximately 5 blocks to reach the bar where we were scheduled to rendezvous with Ethan and the rest of our assembled company. So we commenced our pedestrian journey, eventually arriving at a busy crosswalk. We patiently waited for the signal to change, joining a small cluster of perhaps 8 other individuals who were similarly poised to cross. I stood there, immersed in my own thoughts, minding my own business, when suddenly, I became aware of a young woman standing directly beside me. Her sudden appearance startled me for 2 distinct reasons. Firstly, she seemed to have materialized out of thin air, as if conjured from the ether. Secondly, she was standing in unnervingly close proximity to me. It almost felt as though she were attempting to huddle into me, like a timid child seeking refuge behind a parent. That's precisely the impression she conveyed, except she wasn't a child. She was leaning into me, her shoulders hunched forward in a posture of almost submissive apprehension. Her hair was raven black and remarkably long, cascading down her back to at least her waist. She was attired in a long, striped dress that reached her ankles, a worn leather jacket, and open-toed sandals. Her physical appearance suggested that she was roughly my age, perhaps a year or 2 younger, but her skin possessed a deep, tan complexion, and her eyes were the most unsettling feature. They were a dark, almost obsidian black, seemingly devoid of any warmth or light. While her attire was unremarkable, her demeanor was anything but. She was behaving in a decidedly peculiar manner, repeatedly pinching her nose as if encountering a foul odor, and constantly, nervously glancing around, as though anticipating some unseen entity to suddenly materialize and seize her. To be perfectly frank, she resembled a frightened, cornered animal. Yet, despite this outward display of anxiety, her overall demeanor was strangely cold. Her eyes felt vacant, empty, as if staring into an abyss. Her face was a mask, utterly devoid of any discernible emotion. Naturally, I found her close proximity deeply unsettling. I discreetly took a few steps to the side, attempting to create some distance between us. And what happened next? She mirrored my movement, stepping towards me, re-establishing the same unnerving closeness she had maintained initially. I found this rather bizarre, to say the least, but I attempted to rationalize the situation, giving her the benefit of the doubt. Besides, the crosswalk signal changed to green at that very moment, allowing us to proceed. I figured that this would resolve the issue, that we would naturally separate as we crossed the street, each going our own way. Wrong. Absolutely, unequivocally wrong. She accompanied me across the street, maintaining that same unsettling proximity for the first few blocks. No matter where I moved, no matter how many times she momentarily became lost in the throng of pedestrians, she would invariably scurry back to my side, re-establishing that uncomfortable closeness. All the while, she continued to pinch her nose and frantically scan our surroundings. She was making me profoundly uneasy. Mrs. Davies, who had clearly observed the unfolding situation, finally decided to intervene. She confronted the girl directly, saying, in a concerned but firm tone, "Excuse me, young lady, do you require assistance? Are you all right? Is there something we can help you with?" The girl's response was chilling. "It's not safe," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the din of the city. After uttering those cryptic words, she slowly lifted her head, tilting it slightly, and locked her gaze directly onto mine. Her mouth, I noticed, quivered almost imperceptibly. Mrs. Davies and I exchanged a look of utter bewilderment. What in the world was happening? At that point, my sole desire was to escape the clutches of this increasingly bizarre individual. It was bad enough that she wouldn't cease invading my personal space and relentlessly following me. But now she was uttering these strange, unsettling pronouncements while staring at me with those vacant, unsettling eyes. Mrs. Davies, ever the protective mother figure, gently pulled me closer to her side and whispered into my ear, "Walk faster, dear. Don't look at her. I want to see if she's truly following us." I complied without hesitation, quickening my pace and deliberately averting my gaze. And guess what? She followed us, relentlessly, persistently, all the way to the bar. Despite Mrs. Davies explicitly instructing her to cease her pursuit, she responded with, "I want to stay with you guys," her voice lacking any inflection, any hint of emotion. Even when we deliberately took unnecessary detours, testing her resolve, attempting to ascertain whether she would continue to follow, she did. She shadowed our every move. I was internally freaking out, my anxiety escalating with each passing moment. We finally reached the bar, our intended destination. We swiftly presented our identification to the bouncer, eager to gain entry and escape this relentless pursuit. But she followed us inside. She actually had the audacity to sit down at our reserved table. She positioned herself at the furthest end, initially, but then, with a disconcerting subtlety, she began to inch closer. She only moved when we weren't directly observing her. You'd glance away for a mere second, and boom, she had managed to scoot one seat closer, all the while maintaining that blank, unnerving stare. Mrs. Davies, understandably, had reached her limit. She rose from her seat and summoned the security guard, a burly individual whose presence alone was enough to deter most troublemakers. She explained the situation, requesting that he remove the girl from our table. The guard approached the girl and informed her, in no uncertain terms, that she had to leave, and she actually argued with him. I couldn't decipher the entirety of their exchange over the blaring music, but I distinctly heard her questioning why she had to depart, insisting that she had the right to sit wherever she pleased. She became increasingly agitated, her demeanor shifting from unsettlingly passive to overtly aggressive, When the guard reiterated that the table was reserved for our party, and that she was not a member of our group, she became visibly agitated, her face contorting with a mixture of frustration and malice. She glared at me with an intensity that sent a fresh wave of chills down my spine, before finally rising from her seat and storming out of the bar. But she didn't leave immediately. She lingered outside, peering in at me through the open patio at the front of the establishment. She remained stationary, seemingly oblivious to the bustling activity around her, the constant flow of people entering and exiting the bar. She stood there, unmoving, for approximately 15 minutes, before finally, mercifully, disappearing into the night. There was just this profoundly unsettling, dark feeling that emanated from her. She made me incredibly nervous, for reasons I couldn't fully articulate. She just felt wrong. Perhaps she was simply under the influence of some illicit substance. But the entire encounter was profoundly creepy, and I sincerely hope I never encounter her again. The whole experience felt like a scene from a poorly written psychological thriller, and I'm still trying to process it all. The gas station gauntlet. The sudden, complete blackout should have been my first clue that this wasn't going to be a typical graveyard shift at the Quick Stop gas station. The second clue? The silenced alarm system. The third? The heavily armed man who appeared moments later. It was a trifecta of terror that transformed a monotonous night into a desperate struggle for survival. My name is Leo Maxwell, and I'm a college student working nights to make ends meet. The Quick Stop, a lone beacon of fluorescent light on a desolate stretch of Highway 17, wasn't exactly a career destination. It was a means to an end, a way to fund my engineering degree. Most nights were uneventful. The occasional long-haul trucker, bleary-eyed travelers, the odd local grabbing a late-night snack. Boredom was my usual adversary. It was a Wednesday, well, technically Thursday morning, around 3 a.m. I just finished mopping the perpetually sticky floor and was contemplating the existential dread of instant coffee when the lights flickered and died, plunging the store into absolute darkness. The emergency lights kicked in, casting an anemic greenish glow that did little to alleviate the sudden, unsettling quiet. Great, I muttered to myself, already reaching for the flashlight we kept behind the counter. Power outages were a semi-regular occurrence, usually due to the aging infrastructure in this part of the state. That's when I heard the vehicle pull up outside. Through the rain-streaked windows, I saw not one, but 3 black SUVs screech to a halt, their headlights extinguished as if on cue. My stomach clenched. This wasn't a typical roadside stop. Before I could even consider reaching for the phone, the doors of the SUVs swung open and figures emerged. At least 5 of them, all dressed in black tactical gear, their faces obscured by balaclavas. They moved with a practiced efficiency that sent shivers down my spine. I ducked down behind the counter, my heart hammering against my ribs. This was it. This was how I died. Not in some grand, heroic blaze of glory, but crouched behind a counter in a nowhere gas station, clutching a flashlight like a weapon. The bell above the door jingled, a sound that had always been cheerfully mundane, now chillingly ominous, as the first of the figures entered. "Nobody move," a gruff voice commanded. It was unnecessary. I was already frozen in place, my breath caught in my throat. I risked a peek over the counter. 2 of the figures were systematically disabling the security cameras, their movements swift and precise. Another was checking the doors, ensuring they were locked. The leader, a tall, imposing man with a voice that could curdle milk, approached the counter. "Where's the safe?" he demanded, his eyes scanning the store. I swallowed hard, trying to find my voice. It's in the back," I stammered. "In the office." He gestured with his head. "Take us there." As I led them towards the back, my mind raced. I needed a plan, any plan. I was outnumbered, outgunned, and utterly unprepared for this. But I wasn't about to just hand over the store's meager earnings without a fight. The office was small and cramped, dominated by an ancient, fireproof safe. The leader gestured to it. "Open it." I fumbled with the combination, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the dial. I knew there wasn't much cash inside, maybe a few $100s. These guys were clearly after something more. "Hurry it up!" the leader growled, impatience creeping into his voice. Finally, the safe clicked open. I swung the heavy door wide, revealing the underwhelming contents. The leader's face contorted with frustration. "That's it? Where's the rest?" "That's all we keep on hand," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Night deposits, you know." He backhanded me across the face, sending me sprawling to the floor. My head smacked against the concrete, and stars exploded in my vision. "Don't lie to me," he hissed. "We know what you have here. Where is it?" I tasted blood, my head swimming. I had no idea what he was talking about. What did they think was here? I don't know," I mumbled, dazed. He signaled to one of his men, who produced a roll of duct tape. "Tie him up," he ordered. "We'll search the place." As they bound my hands and feet, I realized this wasn't a simple robbery. They were looking for something specific, something they believed was hidden somewhere in this rundown gas station. And they were willing to tear the place apart to find it. They left me in the office, gagged and bound, while they ransacked the store. I could hear them ripping apart shelves, smashing displays, their frustration growing with each passing minute. I struggled against my bonds, but the duct tape was strong, unyielding. Then, through the muffled sounds of destruction, I heard a different noise. Faint, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from beneath me. I strained my ears, trying to pinpoint the source. The tapping continued, growing slightly louder. It seemed to be coming from the floor itself. Hope, a tiny, fragile spark, flickered within me. I remembered something old Mr. Henderson, the previous owner, had told me once, a rambling story about a hidden storage room beneath the office, built during the Prohibition era. He'd dismissed it as a senile old man's fantasy. But what if? I began to shift my weight, rocking back and forth, trying to find a weak spot in the floorboards. My movements were restricted by the duct tape, but I persisted, driven by a desperate need to find a way out. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I felt something give way beneath me. A section of the floor, cleverly disguised, shifted slightly. With renewed effort, I rocked harder, and the section popped open, revealing a dark, narrow opening. I managed to wriggle free of the duct tape binding my legs, then, with great difficulty, worked on freeing my hands. The sharp edge of a broken floorboard proved surprisingly effective. As soon as my hands were free, I ripped the gag from my mouth, gulping in air. I peered into the opening. It was a steep drop, at least 10 feet into pitch blackness. I had no idea what was down there, but it had to be better than waiting for the thieves to return. Taking a deep breath, I lowered myself into the hole, letting go and bracing for impact. I landed hard, my ankle twisting painfully, but I was down. I was out of the office. I fumbled for my flashlight, clicking it on. The beam illuminated a narrow, dusty passage, barely wide enough to crawl through. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and something else, something metallic. I began to crawl, my injured ankle throbbing with each movement. The passage seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning in the darkness. I had no idea where it led, but I had to keep moving. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw a faint glimmer of light ahead. I crawled faster, my heart pounding with anticipation. The passage opened into a small, concrete room, and there, in the center of the room, bathed in the faint glow of my flashlight, was a metal crate. This was it. This was what they were looking for. But what was inside? I approached the crate cautiously. It was heavy, sealed shut with a thick padlock. I tried to pry it open, but it wouldn't budge. Then I heard voices. They were coming from the passage I'd just crawled through. The thieves had found the hidden room. Panic seized me. I was trapped. There was nowhere to go. I looked around frantically, searching for a weapon, anything to defend myself. My eyes fell on a rusty pipe leaning against the wall. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I gripped the pipe tightly, my knuckles white, and waited. The first of the thieves emerged from the passage, his face contorted with rage. "There you are," he snarled. He lunged at me, and I swung the pipe with all my might. Connected with a sickening thud, he went down, clutching his head, groaning, but the others were right behind him. I fought like a cornered animal, swinging the pipe, kicking, biting, anything to stay alive. But they were too many. They overpowered me, disarming me and pinning me to the ground. The leader stood over me, his face a mask of cold fury. "You should have stayed out of this," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Now you're going to pay the price." He raised his hand, and I saw the glint of a knife. I closed my eyes, bracing for the inevitable, but the blow never came. Instead, I heard a shout, followed by the sound of gunfire. I opened my eyes to see chaos. The thieves were scattering, their leader lying on the ground, clutching his leg. Standing in the entrance to the room, silhouetted against the faint light of the passage, were two figures. Police officers. "Freeze!" One of them yelled. "Drop your weapons." It was over. As the officers secured the thieves and paramedics tended to my injuries, I learned the truth. The crate contained not drugs or money, but stolen microchips, highly advanced technology worth millions on the black market. The gas station, with its hidden room, had been a drop point for years, unbeknownst to me or the current owner. The police had been tracking the thieves for months, waiting for them to make their move. My accidental discovery of the hidden room had forced their hand. They called me a hero, but I didn't feel like one. I was just a guy trying to get through his shift, a guy who'd stumbled into something far bigger and more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. As I sat in the back of the ambulance, wrapped in a blanket, watching the sun rise over the now bustling gas station, I couldn't help but wonder what would have happened if I hadn't found that hidden room. If I'd just stayed behind the counter, oblivious to the drama unfolding around me. Would I have survived? Or would I have become another casualty in a game I didn't even know I was playing? One thing was for sure, I'd never look at a late-night gas station the same way again, and I'd definitely be investing in a better flashlight. The enigmatic encounter at Grandma's house. This story unfolds from a dual perspective, incorporating both my own recollections and those of my younger brother, Daniel. These are the unvarnished, factual events of a night that transpired just last night, while I was visiting my grandmother's house. Before I delve into the heart of the matter, some preliminary context is necessary. Following an afternoon spent procuring fast food from a McDonald's in the nearest city, a drive of approximately 20 minutes, I opted to visit my grandmother rather than immediately returning home. Her residence is situated in a profoundly rural setting, down a lengthy, unpaved farm road. To reach her house, one must also navigate a half-mile dirt driveway, a veritable track carved through the wilderness. I arrived there around 9 p.m., entering the house to find my grandmother and Daniel, who has resided with her since our grandfather's passing, providing her with companionship and assistance. Around 10:30 p.m., Daniel and I escorted my grandmother's dog, a rather excitable terrier named Sparky, outside for his evening constitutional. We lingered outdoors, enveloped by the tranquil night, listening to music and engaging in casual conversation. As the temperature began to drop, this is East Texas, and I am unaccustomed to the chill of nights that dip into the low 40s. I felt a growing desire to retreat indoors. It was at this precise moment that I perceived movement in the periphery of my vision, near the large metal workshop that stands several hundred yards from the house. Initially, I dismissed it, attributing it to the frequent nocturnal visits of deer, raccoons, or other creatures of the night. Sparky, normally quick to react to any perceived intrusion, remained remarkably calm, further reinforcing my assumption that it was merely an illusion, a trick of the fading light. We finally returned inside, and my grandmother retired to bed around 11 p.m. Daniel and I, however, remained awake, engrossed in a game of Among Us and various YouTube videos. By approximately 2:30 a.m., fatigue had overtaken me, and I was eager to return home. I requested that Daniel accompany me to the door, ensuring my safe passage to my car, as I am perpetually plagued by an overactive imagination, particularly under the cloak of darkness. He playfully teased me, joking about extinguishing the porch light and locking the door behind me, a prospect that filled me with genuine alarm. I implored him to walk me to the car, and he eventually relented, indulging my anxieties. I entered my car, immediately securing the doors, and commenced my journey back down the winding dirt road. I arrived home within 10 minutes, prepared a bowl of ice cream, and settled down to watch some chilling scary stories on YouTube, a seemingly innocuous pastime that would soon take on a new, unsettling dimension. Another 15 minutes or so elapsed, and my phone buzzed with an incoming FaceTime call from Daniel. I answered almost instantaneously, immediately sensing his palpable distress. He remained silent for a few agonizing moments, prompting me to inquire with growing concern, "What's wrong, Daniel?" The following is my best attempt to paraphrase the harrowing account my brother relayed to me, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and disbelief. He explained that, after my departure, he had returned outside, intending to resume listening to music while relaxing on the porch. He had the volume on his phone turned up relatively high, a level that typically masked the sounds of any animals venturing from the nearby woods. After a few minutes of listening to music, he distinctly heard what he described as the sounds of metal clanging together. He immediately paused the music, straining his ears to ascertain whether the sound would recur. He rose from his seated position and directed his gaze towards the workshop and the adjacent boat shed, both structures situated several hundred yards from his location. He observed a faint, flickering light emanating from the vicinity of the boat shed, but it was quickly extinguished. At this point, he was genuinely alarmed, his apprehension escalating rapidly. He stealthily retreated inside the house, locking the door behind him. He recounted how he raced to his room at the rear of the house, apparently neglecting to awaken our grandmother in his panicked state. He retrieved a weapon, a sturdy, wooden baseball bat, and swiftly returned outside. He now saw the distinct glow of a flashlight moving around, illuminating the interior of the boat shed. He advanced to the edge of the concrete carport, his eyes fixed on the distant structure. The only source of illumination was the faint, ambient light emanating from the house. He attempted to muster the most intimidating tone he could manage, bellowing, "Who's out there?" There was no immediate reply, only a slight, muffled bumping sound, confirming beyond any doubt that someone was, indeed, present. Keep in mind, this is deep in the heart of the countryside, in a town with a population of just over 1,000 people. The nearest neighboring house is either across the lake or miles down the farm road. No well-intentioned individual would simply stumble upon my grandmother's property at this late hour. Furthermore, my grandmother had experienced previous incidents of individuals trespassing on her property, snooping around with unknown intentions. Therefore, this was not a situation any of us took lightly, and for the life of me, I cannot fathom why Daniel did not immediately contact the police. But you must also consider that there is literally one police officer in our entire town, and it was 3 a.m. It would take at least 30 minutes, if not longer, for the officer to even arrive on the scene. So, my brother once again demanded that the individual reveal themselves. He described seeing a tall, lanky figure slowly emerge from the confines of the boat shed, flashlight in hand. Although Daniel was unable to discern any distinct facial features, he could definitively determine that it was an older man, and certainly not anyone we recognized. Most certainly not anyone who had any legitimate reason to be inside our boat shed at 3 a.m. At this point, Daniel shouted again, "Who are you?" The man remained silent, continuing his slow, deliberate advance towards my brother. Daniel brandished the baseball bat, waving it back and forth, and issued one final, desperate warning. "Tell me who you are now. Why are you here?" The man abruptly raised his hands in a gesture of surrender, uttering, "Whoa, whoa, whoa! Calm down, man." As he continued his approach, Daniel again waved the weapon menacingly. The man, without warning, suddenly turned and fled down the driveway, prompting my brother to scream, "I wouldn't come back if I were you." Daniel then quickly ran back inside, finally awakening my grandmother, who, inexplicably, had slept through the entire commotion. She didn't seem sufficiently concerned to contact the police, but of course, upon hearing this account, all I could think was, what were the true intentions of that man? Was he merely a drug addict, scavenging for tools to pawn for drug money? Or were his motives far more sinister? Another question that haunts me, that continues to gnaw at the edges of my mind, is, how many times has this occurred after my grandmother and brother retired for the night, unbeknownst to us? Was he lurking in the shadows all night, observing us? Was he watching me as I walked to my car? What would have transpired if Daniel had, indeed, extinguished the lights and locked the door before I reached my vehicle? The entire incident truly unsettled me for a considerable period, and I'm still not entirely at peace with it. But it's easier to cope with now. The unanswered questions, the lingering uncertainty, those are the things that continue to haunt me. The sheer audacity of the man, approaching our house in the dead of night, the blatant disregard for our privacy and safety. It's truly chilling. The uninvited guest and the vanishing smile. It was the summer immediately following my graduation from high school, a period of newfound freedom and burgeoning adulthood. A close friend of mine, whom I'll call Alex, and I, fueled by youthful exuberance and a naive sense of invincibility, decided to embark on a camping adventure. We had grown up in the sprawling urban landscape of the greater Los Angeles area. Consequently, our collective knowledge of the wilderness, of the intricacies of outdoor survival, was woefully limited, confined to the rudimentary skills we had acquired during a brief stint in the Cub Scouts of America back in our elementary school days. In essence, we were utterly clueless, venturing into the unknown with a reckless disregard for proper planning and preparation. We packed a rather flimsy tent, a couple of threadbare sleeping bags, a haphazard assortment of supplies, and, with a youthful optimism that bordered on delusion, set off in Alex's battered, hand-me-down sedan. This was the 1980s, a time before the ubiquitous presence of mobile phones and other portable digital devices. Our reliance on technology was minimal, our reliance on sheer dumb luck maximal. We drove north on the 395 highway for approximately 6 hours, a seemingly endless expanse of asphalt stretching before us. Then we veered westward, venturing into the rugged, mountainous terrain of the Inyo National Forest. Our first and perhaps most egregious error was our failure to designate a specific campsite. We were operating on a play-it-by-ear philosophy, a strategy that, in retrospect, was utterly foolish. Our second, equally significant blunder was our departure time. We left in mid-afternoon, ensuring that by the time we reached the general vicinity of our intended camping area, we were enveloped in the inky blackness of a moonless night. The dust, churned up by our tires as we navigated the unpaved dirt road, overwhelmed the feeble beam of our headlights, rendering them virtually useless. When we finally decided to pull over and establish our camp, it was around 11:30 p.m. We were exhausted, famished, and utterly disoriented. Any location at that point seemed as good as any other, our criteria for selection reduced to sheer desperation and a primal need for sustenance and rest. Our third, and potentially most dangerous, mistake was our complete lack of adequate lighting. We had brought no flashlights, no lanterns, only the flimsy, unreliable flames of our Bic cigarette lighters. We attempted, with a comical ineptitude, to erect the tent using this pathetically inadequate illumination, supplemented by the dim glow of the car's headlights, which were parked a frustrating distance of 10 to 15 feet away. The wind, a persistent, gusting presence, constantly extinguished our lighters, either directly, with a sudden, forceful blast, or indirectly, by pushing the flickering flame onto our thumbs, causing us to yelp in pain and drop the lighter into the dirt. It was, to put it mildly, a complete and utter disaster. We eventually managed, through sheer perseverance and a healthy dose of luck, to assemble the tent, albeit in a rather haphazard fashion. By that point, however, I was too exhausted, too overwhelmed by the sheer absurdity of our predicament to even contemplate eating. Alex, possessing a slightly greater resilience, managed to prepare some instant ramen noodles over a pathetically small and smoky fire. We smoked a cigarette in the relative safety of the car, seeking refuge from the relentless wind, and then, utterly defeated, crawled into the tent, seeking the solace of sleep. We awoke to a bitterly cold morning, the sun barely peeking over the horizon. It must have been around 5:30 a.m. Immediately upon exiting the tent, we realized, with a sinking feeling of mortification, that we had inadvertently established our camp at the very entrance to a well-marked hiking trail. There were at least 2 prominently displayed no camping signs within a shockingly short distance of our tent, signs that had been completely invisible to us in the darkness of the previous night. We hastily dismantled the tent, gathered our meager belongings, and, with a sheepish sense of embarrassment, retreated from our ill-chosen campsite. That morning, we purchased some inexpensive, yet infinitely more practical, flashlights, and indulged in a hot, satisfying meal at a roadside diner in a tiny, almost forgotten settlement. It wasn't truly a town, more like a cluster of storefronts along a main road, the entire length of which could be traversed in a leisurely stroll. We ventured into some sort of official-looking office, though I cannot recall its precise function. It might have been a park ranger station, or perhaps the administrative headquarters for a nearby campground. Regardless, we managed to locate and reserve a legitimate campsite for the upcoming night. The campground was essentially a large, circular clearing, with individual campsites arranged along its outer circumference. Each campsite was spaced approximately 50 yards from its neighbor, providing a modicum of privacy. In the center of the circle was a communal bathroom and shower facility, a welcome luxury after our previous night's primitive conditions. We circled the campground once, observing only one other family, who were meticulously setting up their elaborate campsite, complete with a tent and a camper van. We located our designated spot, a considerable distance from the aforementioned family, and proceeded to erect our tent, this time with a slightly greater degree of competence, aided by our newly acquired flashlights. That night, however, is when the truly unsettling encounter occurred. Alex and I were lying in the tent, shining our flashlights upwards, engaging in idle conversation. Our new flashlights, alas, proved to be less than durable, their batteries rapidly depleting, leaving us once again in darkness. Our fire pit, a mere 6 feet from the tent's entrance, was reduced to a bed of glowing embers. We should have extinguished it completely, and we certainly shouldn't have positioned the tent so close to it, but hindsight, as they say, is always 20/20ths. There we were, chattering away, enjoying our youthful camaraderie, when Alex suddenly became preoccupied with his foot. After the 3rd or 4th time, he abruptly sat up, examining his foot with a perplexed expression. I inquired as to the cause of his concern. He explained, with a mixture of annoyance and bewilderment, that something was repeatedly tapping his foot from the outside of the tent. His foot was pressed against the side of the tent, creating a visible bulge from the exterior. It felt, he said, as though pebbles were being flicked at his foot through the fabric of the tent. "There it is again," he exclaimed, his voice tinged with a growing sense of unease. "What the heck is that?" We initially dismissed it with a nervous laugh, attributing it to a twig or a blade of grass swaying in the wind, or perhaps a loose strap on the exterior of the tent flapping against the fabric. However, at some point, and I cannot precisely recall the exact sequence of events, we both simultaneously fell silent. A sound, distinct and unmistakable, reached our ears: footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, approaching our tent. We initially speculated that it might be a bear or some other non-human animal, but the rhythm, the cadence of the steps seemed distinctly bipedal. They were incredibly slow and measured, each step separated by an interval of approximately 2 seconds. Finally, in a hushed whisper, I uttered the words that had been forming in my mind. "Someone's out there." Alex didn't move. His face, illuminated by the faint, residual glow of the embers, was etched with an expression of mounting fear. At some point, with no visible transition, Alex was gone. He didn't move to smoke. That was not his vice. I was there alone. I sat up, my heart pounding against my ribs, and retrieved the only weapon I possessed, a Swiss Army pocket knife. I extended the large and small blades, as well as the central ice pick, holding it like some ludicrous, improvised melee weapon, a pathetic attempt at self-defense. I could see the glowing embers of the fire pit through the sheer nylon fabric of our tent, and I could vaguely discern some of the rocks surrounding it. I watched, I listened, my senses hyper-alert, every nerve ending tingling with apprehension. The footsteps drew closer, maintaining that same slow, deliberate pace. With each step, I could hear the crunch and grind of dirt and gravel underfoot. At some point, it became undeniably clear to me that whoever it was standing directly between the tent and the fire pit. My fuzzy, obstructed view of the burning embers through the nylon tent wall became obscured by a dark, solid shape. The footsteps ceased directly in front of our tent, a mere 6 to 8 inches from the entrance. Silence descended, a heavy, suffocating silence that seemed to stretch on for an eternity. It lasted for perhaps a minute, and then I heard a distinct click. At that precise moment, I clearly saw through the nylon tent wall a flashlight being switched on. I could see not only the beam of the flashlight, but also the outline of the hand that held it. The flashlight was shining directly onto the zippered entrance of our tent, mere inches from the zipper itself. Blood drained from my head. My palms instantly became slick with sweat. I yelled, my voice a mixture of fear and forced aggression, "Who's there?" The person, whoever it was, immediately extinguished their flashlight. I remained motionless, paralyzed by fear, but so did they. They simply stood there, inches from the tent's only entrance, their presence a palpable, menacing weight. Felt like an eternity, but after what was probably closer to 10 minutes of agonizing silence, I heard the sound of feet slowly turning in the dirt, then the gradual, deliberate retreat of footsteps, moving away from the tent. I remained awake for the entirety of the night, my senses on high alert, every muscle tense and coiled, ready to spring into action at the slightest provocation. It wasn't until the first rays of dawn began to filter through the fabric of the tent that I finally succumbed to exhaustion, collapsing into a fitful, uneasy sleep. The intense heat inside the tent eventually roused us, the sun beating down mercilessly upon the nylon fabric. It was nearly noon by this point. We ventured outside, inspecting the campsite for any signs of our nocturnal visitor. We found nothing missing, no evidence of theft or vandalism. However, we did discover a series of boot prints, clearly visible in the soft earth, circling our campsite and leading away towards the edge of the campground and beyond. That marked the last time I ever camped in a tent. The memory of that night, the chilling sound of footsteps, the sudden click of a flashlight, the unseen presence lurking just inches away, remains etched in my mind. A stark reminder of the vulnerability, the inherent risks, of venturing into the unknown, unprepared and unprotected. The sheer terror I felt, the absolute helplessness, it's a feeling I never want to experience again. The town frozen in time. The moment our tires crossed the unmarked boundary, a subtle shift in the atmosphere signaled that we had entered a place unlike any other. Millhaven. The name, whispered by the GPS as we veered off the main highway due to an unexpected detour, held no significance then. It would soon become synonymous with a chilling, inexplicable reality. My name is Daniel Carter, and this is the account of how a simple family vacation became a desperate fight for survival against forces we couldn't comprehend. My wife, Olivia, our 2 children, 16-year-old Sophie and 12-year-old Ben, and I were en route to my parents' lake house, a cherished annual tradition. A sudden, violent thunderstorm, however, forced us off our familiar route, sending us down winding back roads and into the unknown. "Are you sure about this, Dad?" Sophie asked from the back seat, her voice laced with a familiar teenage blend of boredom and apprehension. Her phone, her lifeline to the outside world, had lost service miles ago. "Just a little further," I replied, trying to project an air of confidence I didn't feel. Our GPS had gone haywire, displaying a map that seemed to bear little resemblance to the actual landscape. We were relying on a tattered road atlas and my increasingly unreliable sense of direction. As we navigated the deepening twilight, a thick, unnatural fog began to roll in, reducing visibility to near zero. It was as if the world outside our car was dissolving, leaving us suspended in a gray, featureless void. Then, through the swirling mist, a sign materialized. "Welcome to Millhaven, where the past is always present." Millhaven, Olivia questioned, leaning forward. "I don't remember seeing that on any map." "Me neither," I admitted, a knot of unease tightening in my stomach. Despite my growing apprehension, we pressed on. The fog seemed to thin slightly as we entered the town, revealing a scene that was both quaint and unsettling. The architecture was distinctly mid-20th century, the buildings seemingly untouched by the passage of time. Classic cars, gleaming as if they just rolled off the assembly line, were parked along the main street. But there were no people, no movement, just an eerie, unsettling stillness. "This is creepy," Ben observed, his voice hushed. I couldn't disagree. It felt like we'd stumbled onto the set of an abandoned movie, a meticulously crafted replica of a bygone era. We decided to stop at what appeared to be the town's only diner, hoping to find someone who could provide directions. The neon open sign flickered weakly, casting a pale, ghostly light. I pushed open the door, a small bell above it jingling merrily, a jarring contrast to the oppressive silence outside. Inside, the diner was a perfect time capsule. Red vinyl booths, a checkered tile floor, a long, formica counter. A handful of patrons were scattered throughout the diner, their faces turned towards us as we entered. Their stares were intense, unblinking, as if we were objects of intense scrutiny rather than weary travelers seeking assistance. "Good evening," I said, approaching the counter where a waitress stood, polishing a glass with a slow, deliberate motion. "We seem to be a bit lost. Could you possibly direct us back to Highway 44? The waitress slowly raised her head, her eyes, a startling shade of pale blue, fixed on mine. "Highway 44? She repeated, her voice a monotone. "There's no Highway 44 near Millhaven." "But our GPS," I began, but she cut me off. "GPS doesn't work here," she said, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on her lips. "Millhaven is special." Before I could respond, the other patrons began to rise from their seats, their movements synchronized, almost robotic. They started to surround us, their faces devoid of any discernible expression. "We'd be happy to show you around," the waitress said, her smile widening, revealing teeth that seemed unnaturally sharp. "Welcome to Millhaven. You'll never want to leave." A wave of pure terror washed over me. This wasn't hospitality. This was a threat. "Thank you, but we really must be going," I said, backing towards the door, my hand firmly gripping Olivia's. "We have a schedule to keep." The patrons continued to advance, their movements silent, relentless. "Run!" I yelled, shoving open the door and pulling Olivia and the children out into the street. We ran, blindly, desperately, the fog swirling around us like a living entity. I had no idea where we were going, only that we had to get away from those things. As we fled, I noticed more disturbing details. The clocks in every shop window were frozen at precisely 8:27 p.m. The few people we encountered on the streets moved with that same unsettling, jerky motion, their eyes following us with an unnerving intensity. And no matter which direction we turned, we always seemed to end up back on the main street, facing that ominous "Welcome to Millhaven" sign. It was as if the town itself was a maze, designed to keep us trapped. "Dad, I'm scared," Sophie whispered, her voice trembling. "I know, honey," I said, trying to sound reassuring. "But we're going to get out of here. I promise." We decided to abandon the car, hoping to find a way out of town on foot. Perhaps the fog was obscuring some escape route. We moved stealthily, keeping to the shadows, avoiding the few figures we encountered. The fog seemed to respond to our movements, parting just enough to allow us to pass, then closing in behind us, creating a sense of claustrophobic confinement. After what felt like hours, but could only have been minutes, given the unchanging time displayed on every clock, we stumbled upon something that offered a glimmer of hope. A small, overgrown path, barely visible through the fog, leading away from the main street. It was the first deviation from the town's rigid, grid-like structure we'd encountered. "This has to lead somewhere," Olivia said, her voice a mix of hope and desperation. We followed the path, our hearts pounding with a mixture of anticipation and dread. The air grew colder, the silence even more profound. The fog thinned slightly, revealing the source of the path. An old, abandoned railway track. As we walked along the tracks, we noticed something even more disturbing. Scattered along the embankment were remnants of other vehicles. Rusted-out cars, a motorcycle, even a bicycle. All of them looked like they'd been there for decades. Their occupants have vanished. "What happened here?" Ben whispered, his eyes wide with fear. I didn't have an answer, but the implications were terrifying. Millhaven wasn't just a strange town. It was a trap, a place where people came but never left. Suddenly, in the distance we heard a sound, a faint, rhythmic chugging. A train. Hope surged through us. If we could reach the train, maybe we could escape. We ran towards the sound, our legs burning, our lungs aching. The tracks led us to a small, dilapidated station, the platform shrouded in fog. And there, emerging from the mist, was the train. It was an old steam engine, its black paint gleaming, its brass fittings polished to a mirror sheen. It looked like something out of a museum, yet it was undeniably real. The train slowed to a halt, its brakes hissing. A single figure, dressed in a conductor's uniform, stood on the platform. "All aboard," he called out, his voice echoing through the stillness. "Last stop, Millhaven." We hesitated. Was this another trap? But what choice did we have? We climbed aboard, finding ourselves in a plush, richly decorated carriage. The other passengers, few in number, were dressed in period clothing, their faces pale and expressionless. They stared at us with that same unnerving intensity we'd encountered in the diner. The train began to move, picking up speed, the rhythmic chugging growing louder. We sat in stunned silence, watching as the fog-shrouded town of Millhaven receded into the distance. Where were we going? What awaited us at the end of the line? I had no answers. As the train plunged deeper into the darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't escaped Millhaven. We'd merely exchanged one form of imprisonment for another, and the true nightmare was just beginning. The conductor walked by and smiled, saying, "Enjoy the ride. It is the last one you will ever take." The Alaskan Apparition. The year was 1977. I was 11 years old, and my family resided in the vast, untamed wilderness of Alaska, approximately 14 miles north of Anchorage. The moment one departs the sprawling urban confines of Anchorage, one is immediately immersed in the raw, untamed beauty of the Alaskan landscape. This particular incident occurred during the summer, a time when the midnight sun casts an ethereal glow upon the land, blurring the lines between day and night. I distinctly recall this period because the original Star Wars film had premiered just weeks prior, igniting within me a fervent, all-consuming obsession. In those days, the town where we lived was, in reality, little more than a network of interconnected roads and unpaved side streets, a scattering of houses nestled amidst a vast expanse of dense forest. Most of the residents commuted to Anchorage for employment, a daily pilgrimage undertaken by both of my parents. They both worked the night shift, leaving me to spend the majority of my evenings alone, a solitary figure in a house surrounded by the whispering silence of the Alaskan wilderness. I had no siblings to share my solitude. Our house, a modest structure, was situated approximately half a mile from the nearest paved road, completely enveloped by towering trees and dense undergrowth. I had no close friends in the immediate vicinity. I knew a boy who resided at the very end of our road. His house, in fact, was the next closest dwelling, yet it still stood a considerable distance of roughly 300 yards from ours. One seemingly ordinary afternoon that summer, I was engrossed in a television program, lost in the flickering images and the comforting drone of the dialogue, when a sharp, insistent knock reverberated through the house. I cautiously approached a window, peering out to ascertain the identity of our visitor. It was the boy from the end of the street, accompanied by another, older individual. I opened the door, a mixture of curiosity and apprehension swirling within me. He introduced the stranger as his cousin, explaining that his family had flown up from some distant, unspecified location for a visit. I cannot recall the cousin's name, nor do I particularly wish to. However, I vividly remember the immediate, visceral unease that his presence evoked. He had long, unkempt blonde hair that cascaded down to his shoulders, framing a face that seemed both youthful and unsettlingly weathered. He was clad in a threadbare t-shirt, partially obscured by a thin, worn leather vest. But it was his eyes that truly captivated my attention, and not in a positive way. They were dark, intensely dark, almost black, and they seemed to hold a depth of something unsettling. I instinctively sensed that this individual was, to put it bluntly, bad news. Even the boy from down the street, my occasional acquaintance, seemed visibly nervous in his cousin's presence. They inquired if they could enter the house. I, adhering to the strict instructions I had been given, informed them that they were not permitted to do so. It was then, with a chilling theatricality, that the cousin reached behind his back and produced a knife. Not just any knife, but the largest, most menacing blade I had ever laid eyes upon. For a fleeting moment, my mind conjured the image of a sword, a weapon more suited to a medieval battlefield than a suburban Alaskan neighborhood. If you've ever seen the film Crocodile Dundee, there's a scene where the protagonist, confronted by a mugger wielding a switchblade, calmly retorts, "That's not a knife," before drawing his own, far larger, Bowie knife and declaring, "This is a knife." That, in essence, was the weapon this boy, this unsettling stranger, held in his hand. I stammered that I was going back inside. I retreated into the house, resuming my position in front of the television, attempting to regain some semblance of normalcy. Approximately an hour later, another knock, this time louder, more insistent, echoed through the house. I returned to the window, my heart pounding in my chest, and peered out. It was him, the cousin, standing alone on our doorstep. The second knock had been significantly more forceful, imbued with a palpable sense of urgency, even aggression. He called out my name. The boy from down the street must have divulged it to him. I remained silent, frozen in place, my mind racing. He departed from the front door and began to circumnavigate the house. My mother, an avid gardener, had a sunroom, a glass-enclosed sanctuary where she cultivated a vibrant array of plants. It featured large, expansive windows that offered an unobstructed view of the interior. I observed him approach these windows, pressing his face against the glass, cupping his hands around his eyes in a desperate attempt to peer into the dimly lit interior. I remained concealed, shrouded in shadow. Thankfully, no lights were illuminated within the house, and I had extinguished the television upon hearing the second knock. He, unable to discern anything within, continued his unsettling circuit of the house. He retrieved that enormous knife, that menacing blade, and began to rhythmically tap it against the exterior wall as he walked, the metallic clang a chilling counterpoint to the otherwise silent afternoon. Then he began to speak, his voice a low, menacing murmur. "I know you're in there," he hissed, his words laced with a chilling certainty. I was, of course, terrified. He knew I was home. I was an 11-year-old child, alone with no means of escape. He knew I couldn't simply hop into a car and drive away. I continued to maintain my silence, clinging to the desperate hope that he might eventually believe I had departed, perhaps to visit a friend elsewhere. How long could this deranged individual sustain this unsettling patrol of our house? He was, after all, relatively young, perhaps 14 years of age. Surely, he would eventually tire of this macabre game, wouldn't he? No. He persisted, his relentless circling continuing for what felt like an eternity, but was probably closer to an hour. I had committed fully to the "I'm not home" charade, remaining silent and motionless, seeking refuge in the deepest shadows of the house. The sun began its slow descent, though, in the Alaskan summer, it never truly sets, merely dipping below the horizon, casting a perpetual twilight across the landscape. He continued his pacing for another 30 minutes or so, and then, abruptly, he was gone. Not being a naive character in a horror film, I remained in my concealed position, my senses on high alert. Eventually, my parents returned home. I was still awake, my body trembling with residual fear. They, however, dismissed the entire incident, their words a hollow reassurance. See? Nothing to worry about. I never again associated with the boy from down the street, my trust irrevocably shattered. I largely confined myself to the interior of our house for the remainder of that summer, the memory of that unsettling encounter lingering like a persistent shadow. There was something profoundly wrong with that boy, something deeply disturbed. Perhaps it was merely my youthful imagination, fueled by fear and uncertainty. Or perhaps, just perhaps, he harbored intentions far more sinister than mere childish mischief. Thankfully, I will never know the answer to that unsettling question. The sheer terror, the feeling of being hunted, trapped in my own home. It's an experience I can never truly erase. The doorbell demon. A few years back, my husband, Mark, a man with an enduring fascination for technological gadgets, brought home a video doorbell from a local electronics emporium. We had been experiencing a recurring problem with petty theft in our neighborhood, a pleasant, yet increasingly vulnerable community in Lake Worth, Florida. We reasoned that this device, with its integrated camera, would serve as a deterrent and, potentially, provide us with irrefutable evidence should the thefts persist. The fundamental principle behind the video doorbell was elegantly simple. The moment anyone approached our porch, triggering the motion sensor, the built-in camera would commence recording. Thus, anyone who ventured within a certain proximity of our front door would be captured on video. Our primary motivation was to apprehend the culprits responsible for the repeated pilfering of our Amazon packages, a frustrating and costly nuisance that had plagued us for months. And, to our immense satisfaction, it worked. The doorbell camera, with its unwavering vigilance, captured clear, indisputable footage of the thieves in the act. We promptly presented this evidence to the local police department, and within a week, we received the gratifying news that the perpetrators had been apprehended. It was a resounding victory, a testament to the effectiveness of modern technology. These individuals had stolen nearly $300 worth of goods from us over the course of approximately 3 months, causing significant inconvenience and considerable frustration with Amazon's delivery service before we finally identified the root cause of the missing parcels. The point being, the video doorbell, despite its relatively hefty price tag, proved to be an invaluable investment, a resounding success in our ongoing battle against neighborhood crime. However, the story doesn't end there. This seemingly innocuous device, this symbol of security and peace of mind, would soon become the source of one of the most unsettling, most profoundly disturbing experiences of my life. Last year, on a seemingly ordinary Thursday morning in January the 24th, to be precise, I awoke to a notification on my mobile phone. We had been so thoroughly impressed with our initial video doorbell that we had subsequently upgraded to a more sophisticated model in late 2018, one that boasted a particularly intriguing feature. This new camera came bundled with a complimentary application, readily downloadable from the Google Play Store. This app provided a live feed directly from the camera, allowing us to monitor our front porch in real time. Furthermore, it included a recording function. If we were unavailable to access the live feed, the camera would automatically record a short video clip, which we could then review at our leisure. A neat, convenient feature, wouldn't you agree? Well, I certainly didn't think so on that particular morning. The app informed me that a video had been recorded at approximately 6 a.m., a clip of several minutes in duration. The last time this had occurred, It was triggered by our neighbor's cat, a fluffy Persian named Snowball, who had decided to take a leisurely nap on our porch in the middle of the night. That particular recording had been quite charming, eliciting a chorus of ahs from both Mark and myself when we reviewed it upon waking. This video, however, was anything but charming. I opened the app, my fingers trembling slightly with a premonition of unease, and pressed play. The initial image that greeted me was a shadowy figure, silhouetted against the dim pre-dawn light on our porch. The doorbell camera emitted a low level of infrared light, enabling it to capture clear images even in near-total darkness. However, this figure was positioned just beyond the range of this infrared illumination, rendering it a mere indistinct shape. But then, the shape began to move, gradually approaching the camera, closer and closer, until, with a sudden, jarring clarity, a face emerged from the shadows, illuminated by the eerie, otherworldly glow of the infrared light. Those of you who are familiar with the appearance of a human face under infrared illumination will understand precisely what I mean when I describe how profoundly disturbing it can be. It distorts features, rendering them almost unrecognizable. Light-colored eyes appear pale, almost white, as if devoid of any life or soul. It imparts an ethereal, ghostly quality to the subject, transforming them into something unnatural. It looked like a specter, a phantom from some forgotten nightmare, but it was undeniably a man. Not that this realization made the prospect of his presence on our porch any less terrifying. This individual had a coarse, unkempt beard, and he was wearing what appeared to be a severely soiled t-shirt. In his left hand, he clutched a stack of what I initially assumed to be miniature newspapers, or perhaps a small, outdated phone book. I couldn't be entirely certain. At one point, he raised this object to his face and appeared to sniff it, inhaling deeply, as if attempting to discern some hidden scent. Then, he began to engage in a series of bizarre, unsettling movements, darting close to the camera, then abruptly retreating, repeating this sequence over and over again. I was utterly baffled, completely unable to comprehend his purpose, until, that is, he leaned in close to the camera, his face filling the screen, and proceeded to lick it. Yes, you read that correctly. He actually licked the camera lens with a long, deliberate sweep of his tongue. It was utterly disgusting. The video captured the act in excruciating detail, revealing the copious amount of saliva coating his tongue, the glistening moisture that he then deposited onto our doorbell. The sheer audacity of it, the blatant disregard for hygiene and decency, was appalling. He knew he was being recorded. As deranged as this individual appeared to be, he possessed sufficient awareness to recognize that it was a video doorbell, and he must have had at least a rudimentary understanding of how such devices function. Because after he had finished his revolting act of licking the camera, and presumably the doorbell itself, he began to display the phone book or the newspapers or whatever it was he held in his hand, pointing to various words and phrases, as if he were attempting to communicate something to us, to convey some hidden message. Then, after a few more gratuitous licks, or perhaps kisses of the doorbell, he began to walk away, a long, glistening string of drool dangling from his chin, a testament to his bizarre, unsettling behavior. He was clearly intoxicated, or under the influence of some mind-altering substance. What precisely, I could not say. I will likely never know. But what I did know with absolute certainty was that it was profoundly creepy, deeply disturbing, to know that he had been so close to me, to us, while we were asleep, vulnerable and unaware. Our house, at the time, was relatively small, and the master bedroom was situated in close proximity to the main hallway, and, consequently, the front door. If he had truly desired to do so, he could have easily shattered the bedroom window and gained entry to our home within a matter of seconds. I was immensely grateful, relieved beyond measure, that he had not been in a violent or aggressive mood that night. Things could have been drastically, tragically different, but perhaps even more unsettling and undeniably sad is the fact that when I showed the video to Mark, he actually recognized the man. According to Mark, he used to reside in our neighborhood, a seemingly ordinary, unremarkable individual who had, through some unfortunate series of events, lost his home, and ended up living on the streets. Apparently, he still frequented the vicinity of his former residence, perhaps drawn by memories of a happier, more stable past, gazing upon the structure that once represented his home, his sanctuary, a poignant reminder of a life that had somehow slipped away. Mark even knew his name. He recalled that the man had occasionally approached him, requesting a cigarette, a small act of kindness in a world that had seemingly turned its back on him. Mark, however, doesn't smoke, so all he could offer was a few dollars and a sincere expression of sympathy. The entire situation oscillates between the realms of the profoundly creepy and the profoundly tragic. Yes, it's undeniably disturbing that he was lurking around our house in the dead of night, engaging in bizarre and unsettling behavior. But the other, perhaps even more chilling aspect, is the realization that he was once just a regular guy, a member of our community. Mark informed me that he was a family man, that he had, at one point, a wife and children, a seemingly idyllic existence that had, somehow, disintegrated, leaving him adrift in a sea of despair and homelessness. Perhaps it was substance abuse, perhaps a devastating divorce that shattered his mental well-being. Whatever the cause, at one time he was just like you and me, an ordinary individual with hopes, dreams, and aspirations. And I suppose that same fate, that same descent into darkness, could befall any of us, given the right, or rather the wrong, set of circumstances. A slow, insidious slide into addiction, a desperate attempt to numb the pain of heartbreak and loss. That, to me, is far more terrifying than any ghost, any ghoul, any supernatural entity. We have absolutely no way of knowing what lies around the corner, what unforeseen tragedies or misfortunes may await us. We can never truly be certain when our last embrace with a loved one will occur, when our final conversation with a cherished friend will take place. We never know when that happiness, that sense of security and contentment, might simply vanish, like smoke in the wind, never to return. So, I strive with a conscious effort to count my blessings, to appreciate the precious moments, the simple joys that life bestows upon us. I endeavor not to take anything for granted, because you truly never know when you might lose it all, when the world as you know it might crumble around you, leaving you adrift in a sea of uncertainty and despair. The fragility of it all, the precariousness of our existence, that's what truly keeps me awake at night. The house on Hemlock Lane. The moment I placed the for sale sign on the manicured lawn of 12 Hemlock Lane, a prickle of unease traced its way down my spine. It wasn't the house itself, a charming, if slightly neglected, two-story Victorian, but rather the unsettling silence that hung heavy in the air, a silence that seemed to swallow even the chirping of birds. Little did I know, this house held secrets far darker than peeling paint and overgrown ivy. My name is Clara Bennett, and I'm a real estate agent in the quiet town of Oak Haven. I'd recently acquired the listing for 12 Hemlock Lane, a property that had been sitting vacant for over a year. The previous owner, an elderly woman named Mrs. Abernathy, had passed away, and her distant relatives were eager to sell. The house was a gem, a true fixer-upper with good bones, as we say in the business. Original hardwood floors, intricate moldings, stained glass windows. It had the potential to be stunning, but there was something off about it, a sense of stillness, of watchful waiting that I couldn't quite shake. My first open house was scheduled for a Sunday afternoon. I arrived early, armed with freshly baked cookies, a classic real estate trick, and a determinately cheerful attitude. I unlocked the front door, the heavy oak creaking ominously as it swung inward. The air inside was cool and still, carrying the faint scent of dust and something else, something indefinable, almost metallic. I spent the next hour staging the house, arranging furniture, opening curtains to let in the sunlight, and strategically placing the cookies to entice potential buyers. Despite my efforts, the house remained stubbornly resistant to cheerfulness. The shadows seemed to linger longer, the silence deeper. The first visitors arrived promptly at 2 p.m., a young couple eager to find their first home. I launched into my practice spiel, highlighting the house's charm and potential, but their enthusiasm seemed to wane with each passing minute. "It's a bit dark, isn't it?" the woman said, her voice hesitant. "And quiet," her partner added, glancing nervously around. "Almost too quiet." I forced a smile. "Well, it is an older house. They tend to have their quirks." They left shortly after, their faces etched with a mixture of disappointment and unease. The next few hours followed a similar pattern. A steady stream of potential buyers came and went, but none seemed genuinely interested. They all cited the same vague complaints: the darkness, the silence, the unsettling vibe. By 4 p.m., I was starting to feel discouraged. I'd sold houses in far worse condition, in far less desirable locations. What was it about this house that was driving people away? As I was contemplating packing up early, a man arrived. He was older, perhaps in his late 60s, with a neatly trimmed beard and piercing blue eyes. He introduced himself as Mr. Silas Blackwood, a local historian. "I'm not interested in buying," he said, his voice a low rumble. "But I am interested in the house's history. I understand it's been vacant for quite some time." I nodded, relieved to have someone to talk to, even if he wasn't a potential buyer. "Yes, the previous owner passed away. It's been empty for over a year." Mr. Blackwood's eyes narrowed slightly. "Mrs. Abernathy, wasn't it? A sad story. But this house, it has a much longer, darker history than most people realize." He began to tell me the story of 12 Hemlock Lane. It was built in the late 1800s by a wealthy industrialist named Elias Thorne. Thorne was a ruthless, ambitious man who amassed his fortune through questionable means. He was also, according to local legend, obsessed with the occult. "They say he built this house on a nexus point," Mr. Blackwood said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "A place where the veil between worlds is thin. He conducted strange rituals in the basement, seeking power, immortality." I tried to laugh it off. "Surely those are just stories," I said, but a shiver ran down my spine. Mr. Blackwood shook his head. "The stories persist for a reason. Thorne disappeared without a trace in 1923. The house has been plagued by misfortune ever since. Accidents, suicides, unexplained phenomena." He paused, his gaze fixed on something behind me. "There have been reports of a presence, a shadow, something that doesn't belong." I turned to follow his gaze, but saw nothing, just the empty hallway, bathed in the fading afternoon light. "I should go," Mr. Blackwood said abruptly, his eyes wide. "It's not safe to be here after dark." He hurried out of the house, leaving me alone with his unsettling tales and my growing unease. I tried to dismiss his words as folklore, as the ramblings of an eccentric old man, but the silence of the house seemed to press in on me, heavy and oppressive. As dusk settled, I decided to pack up. I gathered my belongings, my movements hurried, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I just wanted to get out of there. I reached the front door, my hand on the knob, when I heard it, a faint, scraping sound, coming from the basement. My blood ran cold. I froze, listening intently. There it was again, a slow, deliberate scrape, 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 like something being dragged across the concrete floor. Against my better judgment, I found myself moving towards the basement door. I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe an animal had gotten inside. But deep down, I knew it was something else. Something Mr. Blackwood's stories had awakened. I slowly opened the basement door, the hinges protesting with a loud creak. The darkness below was absolute, the air thick with that strange, metallic scent. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. Silence. Then the scraping sound again, closer this time. I fumbled for my phone, turning on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing a damp, musty space filled with cobwebs and forgotten junk. And there, in the far corner, something moved. A shadow, darker than the surrounding darkness, seemed to coalesce to take form. It was tall and gaunt, with limbs that seemed too long, too distorted to be human. And its eyes, They glowed with an unholy red light. I screamed, dropping my phone. The flashlight beam flickered and died, plunging me into absolute darkness. I heard the scraping sound again, closer now, accompanied by a low, guttural growl. I scrambled backwards, my hands desperately searching for the stairs. I had to get out of here. I had to escape. I found the stairs and stumbled upwards, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. I reached the door, fumbling with the handle, my fingers slick with sweat. Finally, the door swung open, and I burst out into the hallway, slamming the basement door shut behind me. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, my keys clutched in my trembling hand. I fumbled with the lock, my eyes darting back towards the house. The windows were dark, the silence unbroken. But I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that something was watching me. Something ancient, something malevolent. I drove away from 12 Hemlock Lane as fast as I could, not daring to look back. I didn't stop until I reached the brightly lit streets of downtown Oak Haven. I never went back to that house. I resigned from my job, changed my phone number, even considered moving to another state. The memory of that shadow, of those glowing red eyes, haunted my dreams. I later learned that the house was demolished, the land deemed unfit for habitation by the town council. But I know that whatever lurked in that basement, whatever Elias Thorne had unleashed, didn't disappear with the bricks and mortar. It's still out there somewhere, waiting, and I pray that no one else ever stumbles upon its dark domain. Because some houses are best left undisturbed, their secrets buried deep beneath the earth, where they belong, the silent spectators of Dormitory 2. This incident transpired during my tumultuous adolescence, when I was a mere 16 years old. I was, at the time, an unwilling resident of an all-boys boarding school nestled in the verdant hills of Tennessee, a far cry from my beloved Boston. I was, to put it mildly, deeply unhappy. I harbored a profound resentment towards the institution, towards the rigid structure, the enforced conformity, and, most significantly, towards my parents, whom I perceived as having banished me to this remote, isolated outpost. During my initial week, I made absolutely no effort to integrate, to forge connections with my fellow students. I wallowed in self-pity, consumed by a burning desire to reach the age of 18, the age of legal emancipation, when I could finally escape this gilded cage and embark on a life of my own choosing, a life free from the constraints and expectations imposed upon me. I was, in essence, a typical angst-ridden teenager, brimming with rebellion and a profound sense of injustice. However, as the days bled into weeks, my initial fury gradually subsided, replaced by a grudging acceptance of my circumstances. I reasoned that since I was, for all intents and purposes, trapped in this institution, I might as well attempt to make the best of it. And that, I decided, involved making some semblance of an effort to socialize, to forge, at the very least, superficial connections with my peers. During one of our designated recreation periods, I observed a small cluster of students from my dormitory, Dormitory 2, congregating around a lunch bench situated adjacent to the basketball court. Summoning my courage, I approached them, tentatively attempting to insert myself into their conversation. When I arrived, a student named Gavin, a lanky, somewhat awkward individual with a perpetually anxious expression, was in the midst of recounting a rather unsettling experience he had allegedly endured while performing his assigned chores within the dormitory. I entered the narrative midstream, but I managed to piece together the gist of his tale. It had been Gavin's turn, his room's designated week, in fact, to clean the dormitory hallway, a long, dimly lit corridor lined with identical doors, each leading to a student's room. Gavin was diligently performing his duties, sweeping and mopping, when he began to experience a distinct and profoundly unsettling sensation, the feeling of being watched. He paused in his work, his eyes darting around the hallway, searching for the source of this unnerving feeling. But the corridor was deserted. Every other resident of the dormitory was occupied elsewhere, engaged in their own assigned tasks in different sections of the building. He was, to all appearances, utterly alone. Gavin, understandably unnerved, attempted to rationalize his apprehension. He reasoned that, coming from a large, boisterous family, accustomed to the constant presence of others, he was simply unaccustomed to genuine solitude. He attributed the unsettling sensation to the unfamiliar silence, the absence of the usual cacophony of family life. So he resumed his cleaning, attempting to dismiss his anxieties as mere overactive imagination. However, the feeling persisted, intensifying with each passing moment. He described experiencing a sudden, inexplicable chill, a wave of goosebumps erupting across his skin, and a distinct sensation of something, standing directly behind him, close enough to breathe down his neck. He was too terrified, too paralyzed by fear, to turn around, to confront the unseen presence. Instead, he abruptly abandoned his cleaning implements and fled, sprinting down the hallway until he encountered other students engaged in their respective chores. He joined them, feigning normalcy, desperately attempting to conceal his inner turmoil. Now, I must confess that, at this point in my life, I was a staunch skeptic, particularly when it came to matters of the paranormal. Yes, I occasionally indulged in watching those cheesy, sensationalized ghost hunting programs, but purely for amusement, for the sheer absurdity of it all. I scoffed at the notion of genuine supernatural phenomena, dismissing it as mere fantasy, the product of overactive imaginations and a gullible public. So, as I listened to Gavin's account, I couldn't help but roll my eyes internally. I was on the verge of dismissing his story as utter fabrication, a blatant attempt to garner attention, when another student, whom I'll call Adam, interjected, recounting his own peculiar experience within Dormitory 2, an experience that eerily corroborated Gavin's narrative. Gavin's story, despite my initial skepticism, lingered in my mind throughout the remainder of the recreation period, a persistent, nagging unease that refused to be dismissed. As we were dismissed, heading back to our respective dormitories for dinner, homework, and the eventual inevitable lights out, the unsettling details of his account continued to replay in my mind. The final moments before the mandated cessation of all activity were spent in my bed, my thoughts still consumed by Gavin's unsettling tale. I vividly imagined the scene he had described, the dimly lit hallway, the feeling of being watched, the chilling sensation of an unseen presence. The fact that I was residing in the very same dormitory, sleeping in a room just a few doors down from the scene of his alleged encounter, only amplified my growing sense of unease. Lights out finally arrived, plunging the room into darkness, save for the faint, ambient glow of the streetlights filtering through the window blinds. Even after a week in this unfamiliar environment, I still struggled to fall asleep in the cramped, uncomfortable confines of my four-person dormitory room. I longed for the familiar comfort of my own bedroom back in Boston, for the freedom to play video games late into the night, for the simple solace of my own bed. I suspect that my intense longing for home, my fervent desire to escape the confines of the boarding school, played a significant role in what transpired next. I must have drifted off to sleep, lost in a reverie of familiar surroundings, because the next thing I remember is waking up, abruptly and inexplicably, in the middle of the night. The room was shrouded in semi-darkness, illuminated only by the faint, filtered glow of the streetlights outside. I was lying on my stomach, my body strangely contorted. I felt a distinct pressure on my spine, as if it were slowly, inexorably bending upwards. It was as though an invisible rope had been attached to my legs, and some unseen force was gradually hoisting me into the air. I struggled to collect myself, to fully emerge from the lingering fog of sleep, when I realized, with a jolt of pure terror, that my leg was indeed being lifted off the mattress. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the sensation ceased. My leg dropped back down onto the bed, the force of the impact sending a fresh wave of goosebumps rippling across my skin. I sat up abruptly, my heart pounding in my chest, my eyes darting around the room, desperately trying to adjust to the darkness. My initial thought, fueled by a lingering skepticism, was that one of my 3 roommates was playing a cruel prank, attempting to exploit my status as the new kid. However, a quick scan of the room revealed that all 3 of them were sound asleep in their respective beds. Their breathing slow and regular, their bodies motionless. A wave of profound unease washed over me, a chilling realization that something truly inexplicable was occurring. I was about to rise from my bed, intending to awaken one of my roommates and recount my bizarre experience, when I saw them. Our room door, a standard institutional-style door, featured a narrow, vertical, rectangular window, offering a limited view of the hallway beyond. And there, silhouetted against the faint, reddish glow of the emergency exit sign at the far end of the corridor, were 2 figures, 2 men. They appeared to be engaged in some sort of intense, yet utterly silent conversation. They moved slowly, deliberately, their hands gesturing emphatically, as if emphasizing certain points in their unspoken dialogue. But there was no sound, not even the faintest whisper. It was a pantomime, a bizarre, unsettling tableau played out in the dead of night. My skeptical mind, still clinging to the remnants of rational explanation, initially assumed that these were students from another room, the perpetrators of the earlier prank, now plotting their next move, their next attempt to torment me or my roommates. Well, the joke was on them, I thought, a surge of adrenaline coursing through my veins. I would sneak up to the door, catch them in the act, and put an end to their childish games. I slowly, cautiously eased myself out of bed, keeping my movements as silent as possible. I crept across the room, my eyes fixed on the 2 silhouetted figures, my heart pounding in my chest. I glanced back at my roommates, confirming that they were still sound asleep, further solidifying my conviction that these were intruders, not members of our own room. I reached the door, my hand trembling slightly as I grasped the cold metal handle. I took a deep breath, steeling my nerves, and then, with a sudden, forceful movement, I flung open the door, fully expecting to confront the 2 mysterious figures. Only, the hallway was empty, utterly, completely deserted. There was no one there. It was impossible. There was absolutely no way these 2 individuals could have vanished so quickly, so silently. I would have seen them, heard them, if they had attempted to flee down the corridor. Besides, there was no conceivable way they could have reached their own rooms in the brief interval between my opening the door and my stepping into the hallway. It made absolutely no sense. And then, just as I was grappling with this inexplicable disappearance, I felt it, a distinct chill on the back of my neck, the unmistakable sensation of something, standing directly behind me, breathing down my neck. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing, a primal fear gripping my heart. Someone was standing behind me. I could feel their presence, their unseen breath on my skin. Anger, fueled by a desperate need to regain control, surged through me. I whirled around, ready to confront whoever, whatever, was lurking in the shadows. But there was nothing. Only the 3 sleeping forms of my roommates, their chests rising and falling with the slow, rhythmic cadence of slumber. I closed the door, my hands still trembling, and retreated to my bed, my mind reeling. I lay back down, my eyes fixed on the door, my senses on high alert. The 2 men were gone. No silhouettes, no shadows, no sign of their presence. I honestly cannot explain what I experienced that night. Even as I recount the events years later, I still struggle to find a rational, logical explanation. Was I still half asleep, caught in the throes of some elaborate, incredibly vivid dream? Had my constant preoccupation with Gavin's story, my subconscious anxieties, somehow manifested in the form of a hallucination? The human brain is a remarkably powerful, yet often unpredictable organ. It is capable of conjuring the most extraordinary illusions, of blurring the lines between reality and fantasy. I could, perhaps, accept that explanation if it weren't for the undeniable fact that I had physically risen from my bed, walked across the room, and kept my eyes fixed on those 2 silhouetted figures throughout the entire sequence of events. I was, to the best of my knowledge, fully awake. So, to the silent spectators, The enigmatic figures who haunted the hallway outside my dormitory room that night. Why did you lift my leg? What were your intentions? What were you discussing in that silent, unsettling pantomime? I suppose I will never know the answers to those questions. The mystery remains, a lingering enigma that continues to haunt the recesses of my mind. The experience, however, undeniably shifted my perspective, opening my mind, however reluctantly, to the possibility of the unexplained, the realm of the paranormal, a realm I had previously dismissed with such unwavering skepticism. The fateful dream and the highway horror. My mother's side of the family is, to put it mildly, extensive. She is one of 7 siblings, 3 brothers and 3 sisters, all of whom are married and have produced a considerable number of offspring. Consequently, when the summer months arrived, heralding the annual family vacation, it was invariably an occasion of boundless merriment, chaotic activity, and endless opportunities for both amusement and misadventure. My grandparents, blessed with considerable financial prosperity, possessed a generous spirit. Each year, they would rent a substantial vacation property, a sprawling lakeside cabin, a luxurious beachside mansion, a temporary haven capable of accommodating our entire, sprawling clan. The year in question, the year that would forever be etched in my memory, my grandparents opted for a large, 4-story lakeside home, a veritable palace of leisure and recreation. It boasted a private dock, a fully equipped game room, a state-of-the-art movie theater, a vast, gourmet kitchen, and, most remarkably, a tubular slide system that connected each floor, a whimsical feature that provided endless entertainment for the younger members of the family. What was intended to be a blissful, idyllic escape, a respite from the mundane realities of everyday life, would soon become the setting for one of the most harrowing, most profoundly unsettling experiences of my young life. Before I delve further into the narrative, I must provide a detailed description of the house's layout, as it is crucial to understanding the subsequent events. The structure was built upon a dramatically steep slope that descended towards the shimmering waters of the lake. The house was, quite literally, constructed horizontally, projecting outwards from the side of the hill. On the portion of the home that was not directly connected to the hillside, a series of tall, sturdy stilts were employed, anchoring the structure to the base of the hill, providing additional support and stability. Between these stilts, a brick enclosure had been constructed, creating a vast, cavernous space beneath the house, a hidden chamber accessible only through a set of cellar doors located on the lowest floor of the residence. This pit, or room, as it was sometimes referred to, was utterly devoid of any amenities. It had a dirt floor which was, in reality, merely the compacted earth of the hillside. It was infested with spiders, rodents, and various other unwelcome creatures. The homeowners, from whom we were renting the property, had explicitly cautioned us against venturing into this area. They explained that it would be a 10-foot drop to the floor, and there was no ladder, no means of egress, for anyone unfortunate enough to find themselves trapped within. Anyone who descended into this subterranean chamber would, essentially, be imprisoned in a tall, dark, concrete-lined hole, a prospect that filled me with a deep, instinctive dread. Returning to the narrative, after the initial flurry of greetings, the exchange of familial pleasantries, and the settling-in process that occupied the first couple of nights, the more mature members of the family, which included myself, my older brother, Daniel, and all of our aunts, uncles, and their respective partners, decided to engage in a game commonly known as sardines. This game is, in essence, a reversed version of hide and seek. One individual is designated as the hider, while the remaining participants become the seekers. All the lights within the house are extinguished, plunging the interior into complete darkness, creating an atmosphere of heightened suspense and anticipation. The hider is granted a 1-minute head start to conceal themselves within the labyrinthine confines of the house. Once they are securely hidden, the seekers commence their hunt, moving silently through the darkened rooms, their senses heightened, their hearts pounding with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. If a seeker happens upon the hider, they do not announce their discovery. Instead, they discreetly, silently join the hider in their concealed location, gradually increasing the number of individuals crammed into the hiding spot. This process continues until all but one seeker has located the hiding place, leaving the final, solitary seeker to stumble around in the darkness, increasingly frustrated and isolated. Now, with a clear understanding of the game's rules, the layout of the house, and the considerable number of participants, you can appreciate how this seemingly innocuous pastime could quickly transform into a recipe for both hilarity and potential mayhem. My Uncle Mark, a man known for his playful nature and competitive spirit, was selected as the initial hider. We extinguished all the lights, plunging the vast house into an inky blackness. After the allotted minute of hiding time had elapsed, the hunt began. My brother, aunts, uncles, and I systematically searched the first couple of floors, our footsteps muffled by the thick carpets, our voices hushed to whispers. We peered under tables, explored closets, investigated behind couches, our hands outstretched, groping blindly in the darkness. After approximately 15 minutes of fruitless searching, with no one having yet located Uncle Mark, an idea, a rather unsettling notion, began to germinate in my mind. Although I initially dismissed it as absurd, I couldn't shake the image of those cellar doors, that dark, forbidding space beneath the house. Given my relative youth, I was around 17 at the time, I was eager to impress my older relatives, to demonstrate my maturity and resourcefulness. I envisioned myself as the triumphant discoverer of Uncle Mark's hiding place, earning the admiration and respect of my family. So, I stealthily, silently detached myself from the group, descending the remaining 2 flights of stairs that led to the bottom floor, the location of the ominous cellar doors. As I reached the landing, I found my body trembling, not with excitement, but with a profound, visceral fear. The cellar doors, in the dim, ambient light filtering from the upper floors, appeared menacing, almost sinister. I approached them cautiously, my hand hovering over the cold metal handles. Before I even attempted to open them, I could distinctly hear sounds emanating from within the chamber, a muffled scuffling, accompanied by a low, almost maniacal giggling. This only served to reinforce my conviction that I had, indeed, located my uncle's hiding place. My fear momentarily transformed into a surge of adrenaline-fueled excitement. I flung open the cellar doors, revealing the dark, gaping abyss below. I whispered down into the void, addressing my uncle, informing him that I had discovered his hiding place and that I was about to join him. He continued to laugh, that unsettling, unnerving giggle echoing up from the depths of the hole. It was distinctly unlike him to behave in such a manner, to persist in his charade without at least acknowledging his discovery or inviting me to descend. Driven by a desperate desire to be the first to find him, I began to lower myself into the hole, clinging to the ledge of the cellar door, my feet dangling precariously in the empty space below. I could hear his laughter growing louder, closer, and I could sense his shifting movements as he approached me. A horrendous, putrid stench assaulted my nostrils the instant I lowered my body further into the hole. It was a vile, nauseating odor, unlike anything I had ever encountered. I still clung to the cellar door, hesitating, momentarily unwilling to release my grip and drop the remaining 5 feet or so to the floor. As I hovered there, suspended between the relative safety of the house and the unknown horrors of the pit below, I could begin to discern a vague, indistinct shape in the darkness. It looked wrong. I couldn't make out any facial features, but the slumped posture, the unnaturally long, dangling arms, filled me with a renewed surge of terror. It was in that moment of hesitation, that moment of profound unease, that I heard my Aunt Clara's voice, calling my name from the upper floors. She announced that they had all located Uncle Mark, and that I was the last remaining seeker. My mind, initially slow to process the implications of her words, finally registered the horrifying truth. The laughter, the stench, the unsettling shape in the darkness. It wasn't Uncle Mark. The immense, overwhelming fear that engulfed me in that instant is something I have never experienced since. A terror so profound, so visceral, that it defies description. Without a moment's hesitation, I hauled myself back up, scrambling out of the hole with a desperate, frantic energy. I instantly fled towards my aunt, screaming for assistance, my voice choked with panic. I babbled incoherently about a man beneath the house, a terrifying presence lurking in the darkness. She, initially confused by my outburst, quickly sprang into action when she, too, heard the unsettling laughter emanating from the cellar. She immediately contacted the police, relaying my frantic description of the intruder, while simultaneously summoning my uncles for assistance. Due to our remote location, it took the police approximately 25 minutes to arrive, a seemingly interminable delay that amplified my terror. When they finally did arrive, it was a scene of controlled chaos, a flurry of flashing red and blue lights illuminating the night. But what truly unnerved me, what sent a fresh wave of chills down my spine, was the arrival of a full SWAT team, a dozen heavily armed officers pouring into the house. It seemed an excessive, almost disproportionate response to what I had initially perceived as a mentally unstable homeless man. Within moments, they emerged from the cellar, escorting a disheveled, deranged-looking individual in handcuffs. It wasn't until later, after the immediate crisis had subsided, that I learned the full, horrifying details of the story. The man they had apprehended was, indeed, mentally unstable, with a warrant out for his arrest for the brutal mutilation of his ex-wife. I also discovered that the putrid stench emanating from the cellar was the result of his own feces. He had apparently been trapped down there for several days, claiming that he had initially entered the cellar to evade police capture, only to become hopelessly lost and disoriented in the darkness. It has been approximately 3 years since this harrowing incident, and the intensity of the memory has gradually diminished with the passage of time. However, there are still nights when I lie awake, my mind replaying the events of that terrifying evening, consumed by a profound sense of gratitude that I did not, in my youthful naivete, release my grip on that cellar door ledge. The what-ifs continue to haunt me, a chilling reminder of the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of seemingly ordinary lives. The whispers of Willow Creek. The moment I saw the road closed sign blocking the entrance to Willow Creek, a sense of foreboding washed over me. My GPS had insisted this was the quickest route to my aunt's cabin, but the deserted road, shrouded in an unnatural stillness, suggested otherwise. Little did I know, I was about to enter a place where the past held a terrifying grip on the present. My name is Sarah Walker, and I was on my way to spend a week at my Aunt Millie's secluded cabin in the Appalachian Mountains. Millie had recently passed away, and I was tasked with sorting through her belongings. It was a bittersweet trip, a chance to reconnect with childhood memories and say a final goodbye to a woman who had always been a source of warmth and wisdom in my life. The drive had been uneventful until I reached the turnoff for Willow Creek. The main road was undergoing construction, according to my GPS, forcing me onto this less-traveled detour. The road closed sign, however, presented a problem. It looked old, rusted, and partially overgrown with weeds, as if it hadn't been moved in years. I hesitated. Turning back would add hours to my journey, and I was already running late. Besides, the road itself looked passable, if a bit rough. I decided to risk it, figuring the sign was outdated or simply meant to deter casual tourists. I carefully maneuvered my car around the sign and continued down the narrow, winding road. The trees on either side grew thicker, their branches intertwining overhead, creating a perpetual twilight. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of damp earth and something else, something faintly acrid like burnt wood. After about a mile, the road opened up into a small valley, and I saw the town of Willow Creek. It was smaller than I'd expected. A cluster of weathered buildings huddled around a central square, dominated by a dilapidated church with a crooked steeple. There were no cars, no people, no signs of life, just an unsettling silence. I drove slowly through the town, my unease growing with each passing moment. The houses were boarded up, their paint peeling, their gardens overgrown with weeds. The few businesses, a general store, a post office, a blacksmith shop were all closed, their windows dark and dusty. It looked like a ghost town, place abandoned long ago. But as I reached the far end of the main street, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Hanging from a lamppost, swaying gently in the breeze, was a scarecrow. But it wasn't a typical scarecrow. It was dressed in tattered clothes, and its head was a human skull. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't just a deserted town. This was something far more sinister. I needed to get out of here. Now, I put the car in reverse, intending to turn around, but as I looked in my rearview mirror, I saw them, figures, emerging from the shadows of the buildings, their faces obscured by the gloom. They were moving slowly, deliberately, towards my car. Panic seized me. I floored the accelerator, spinning the tires on the loose gravel. The car fishtailed wildly, then lurched forward, back towards the road closed sign. But as I approached the turnoff, I realized with horror that it was blocked. A large tree had fallen across the road, completely obstructing the passage. It hadn't been there before. I was trapped. I slammed on the brakes again, my car skidding to a halt just inches from the fallen tree. I looked back towards the town. The figures were closer now, their shapes more distinct in the fading light. They were tall and gaunt, their clothes ragged, their movements unnatural, almost jerky, and they were carrying weapons. Rusty farm tools, axes, pitchforks. I had to think, to find a way out. My eyes darted around, searching for any possible escape route. That's when I saw it. A narrow, overgrown track leading into the woods, barely visible through the dense undergrowth. It was a long shot, but it was my only chance. I shifted the car into gear and drove towards the track, bouncing over rocks and roots, the undercarriage scraping against the uneven ground. The figures were gaining on me, their silent pursuit even more terrifying than any shouted threat. The track narrowed, the trees pressing in on either side, branches scraping against the car's paintwork. I could hear them behind me, their footsteps pounding on the ground, their breathing ragged and harsh. Suddenly, the track opened up into a small clearing, and there, in the center of the clearing, stood a cabin. My aunt's cabin. Relief washed over me, quickly followed by a surge of fear. What if they followed me here? What if this wasn't a refuge, but another trap? I didn't have time to hesitate. I slammed on the brakes, jumped out of the car, and ran towards the cabin, fumbling with the keys. The door swung open, and I stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind me and locking it. I leaned against the door, my heart pounding, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I was safe for now, but for how long? The cabin was dark and dusty, the air thick with the scent of decay. I found a flashlight in a drawer and switched it on, the beam cutting through the gloom. The interior was much as I remembered it from childhood visits. A small living area with a stone fireplace, a tiny kitchen, a single bedroom. But there was something different, something unsettling. The furniture was covered in dust sheets, as if my aunt had been preparing to leave, but had never finished. And on the walls, there were strange symbols, painted in what looked like dried blood. I felt a chill run down my spine. What had happened here? What was this place? I heard a noise outside, a scratching at the door. They had found me. I backed away, my eyes fixed on the door, the flashlight beam shaking in my hand. The scratching grew louder, more insistent. Then, a voice, low and raspy, whispered through the cracks in the wood. "Let us in, Sarah. We know you're in there." My blood ran cold. How did they know my name? "We just want to talk," the voice continued. "We want to welcome you to Willow Creek." I didn't answer. I knew that opening the door would be suicide. The scratching stopped. Silence. Then a different sound. A rhythmic thumping, coming from the roof. They were trying to get in through the roof. I looked around frantically, searching for a weapon, anything to defend myself. My eyes fell on the fireplace poker, leaning against the stone hearth. I grabbed it, the cold iron reassuring in my grip. The thumping grew louder, closer. Suddenly, a section of the ceiling above me gave way, showering me with dust and debris. A figure dropped down, landing heavily on the floor. It was one of the figures from the town, tall and gaunt, its face obscured by a burlap sack. But through the holes in the sack, I could see its eyes, glowing with that same unholy red light I'd seen in the house on Hemlock Lane. It was a similar evil. It lunged at me, and I swung the poker with all my might. The blow connected with a sickening thud, and the figure staggered back, groaning. But it didn't fall. It just kept coming. We fought, a desperate, brutal struggle in the confined space of the cabin. I swung the poker again and again, connecting with flesh and bone, but the creature seemed impervious to pain. It grabbed my arm, its grip like iron, its long, sharp fingernails digging into my skin. I screamed, struggling to break free. Then, I remembered something my aunt had told me years ago, a story about the local folklore, a story about creatures that couldn't stand the touch of iron. With a surge of adrenaline, I wrenched the poker free and plunged it into the creature's chest. The effect was immediate. The creature shrieked, a high-pitched, inhuman sound, and its body began to convulse. Black smoke poured from the wound, filling the cabin with a suffocating stench. Then, with a final, agonizing scream, the creature dissolved into dust, leaving nothing behind but a lingering smell of sulfur. I stood there, panting, the poker still clutched in my hand, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. But I knew it wasn't over. There were more of them out there, and they wouldn't give up easily. I had to find a way out of this nightmare. I had to escape Willow Creek. As the first rays of dawn filtered through the cabin's windows, I formulated a plan. A desperate, risky plan, but it was my only hope. I would use the car. I would drive back through the town, straight through those creatures, and hope that I could break through whatever barrier was keeping me trapped. It was a suicide mission, but I had to try. For Millie, for myself, for the chance to see the sun rise over a world that wasn't filled with shadows and whispers and the chilling, unholy glow of those red eyes. I took a deep breath, gripped the poker tightly, and opened the cabin door. The fight for survival had begun. The VHS vault, a chronicle of unease. This may sound peculiar to some, perhaps even anachronistic in this digital age, but I am an avid collector of films on VHS video home system, the magnetic tape format that once reigned supreme in the realm of home entertainment. My collection, a testament to my enduring passion, currently numbers over 1,000 cassettes, and it continues to expand with each passing week, a constantly growing library of cinematic history. My weekends are largely devoted to scouring thrift stores, rummaging through dusty boxes in forgotten corners, and diligently monitoring online marketplaces, all in pursuit of intriguing, rare, and often overlooked cinematic gems. On occasion, I acquire entire lots or boxes of tapes, bulk purchases that often include a mixture of commercially released films and, more intriguingly, home recordings, forgotten television broadcasts, cherished family memories, amateur cinematic endeavors, all deemed expendable, relegated to the realm of unwanted relics. There was a time, a not-so-distant past, when I derived immense pleasure from cuddling up with my girlfriend, Brittany, a woman of exquisite taste and a shared appreciation for the cinematic arts, and immersing ourselves in the unpredictable world of these forgotten recordings. While the majority proved to be mundane, unremarkable, even tedious, I occasionally stumbled upon something truly extraordinary, something that transcended the ordinary and ventured into the realm of the unsettling, the bizarre, the profoundly disturbing. A couple of years ago, I was perusing Craigslist, the online classifieds behemoth, when I encountered an advertisement that immediately piqued my interest. A box of VHS cassettes offered free of charge to the first individual who could collect them. The owner, it seemed, simply desired to rid themselves of these cumbersome relics, to reclaim the space they occupied. Naturally, I seized upon the opportunity, eager to add to my ever-growing collection. An hour later, I was parked in front of my television set, a vintage CRT model that perfectly complemented the aesthetic of my VHS collection, surrounded by a large, cardboard box brimming with tapes. The haul comprised 44 cassettes in total. Many were blank, devoid of any identifying labels, or contained home recordings of equally ambiguous content. A mystery, to be sure, but one that I relished. I had a few precious hours to spare before my work shift commenced, so I selected a couple of tapes at random and, settling back into the plush cushions of my sofa, initiated my cinematic exploration. The first tape contained a recording of an episode of the original Battlestar Galactica, a nostalgic trip back to my childhood. The second, disappointingly, was blank. Satisfied, for the moment, I carefully placed the box in a nearby closet, intending to resume my exploration at a later date. I then departed for work, my mind already anticipating the treasures, or perhaps the disappointments, that awaited me. The box remained untouched, forgotten, for approximately 9 months. In the intervening period, I acquired countless additional tapes, my collection expanding to such an extent that it began to encroach upon every corner of my spare bedroom. I constructed a massive, custom-built shelving unit to accommodate this burgeoning cinematic archive, meticulously inventorying each tape as I placed it in its designated slot. It was during this process of organization and cataloging that I rediscovered the forgotten box, the one I had acquired from Craigslist so many months prior. I realized, with a flicker of excitement, that I had never fully explored its contents, that there were still numerous tapes awaiting my scrutiny. I designated a specific evening, a Friday night, for this cinematic endeavor, inviting Brittany to join me as was our custom. I remember that night with a vivid, almost painful clarity. Brittany arrived shortly after 7 p.m. We prepared dinner together, a simple yet satisfying meal, followed by a decadent dessert of Butterfinger ice cream, a shared indulgence. Around 9 p.m., we settled onto the sofa, enveloped in the warm glow of the television screen, and commenced our exploration of the forgotten tapes. The next few hours were a journey through a diverse and unpredictable landscape of recorded media. We watched a recording of NBC primetime programming from 1987, a nostalgic glimpse into the television landscape of a bygone era. We endured 3 rather lackluster movies from HBO, a testament to the uneven quality of premium cable programming. And we witnessed a wedding, recorded in 1991, a poignant, slightly awkward, yet ultimately heartwarming glimpse into the lives of strangers. Brittany, in particular, was captivated by the wedding video, her romantic sensibilities clearly engaged. The fourth tape, intriguingly, also contained a wedding recording. I watched a portion of it, my attention waning slightly, before excusing myself for a brief bathroom break and a much-needed cigarette. When I stepped away, Brittany was fully engrossed in the ceremony, her eyes glued to the screen, seemingly oblivious to my absence. I slipped outside onto the porch, the cool night air a welcome contrast to the warmth of the interior. I lit a cigarette, inhaling deeply, the nicotine providing a momentary respite from the mounting tension that I hadn't even realized I was experiencing. The entire ritual took no more than 5 minutes, a brief interlude in our cinematic marathon. Upon my return to the bedroom, I grabbed a refill of water, intending to rejoin Brittany and resume our viewing. It was as I was pouring the water, my back to the television, that I heard Brittany scream my name. It was a scream that pierced the quiet stillness of the room, a sound laced with pure, unadulterated terror. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest, adrenaline surging through my veins. I rushed into the room, my eyes frantically searching for the source of her distress. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, her hands clasped tightly over her mouth, her eyes wide with horror, fixed upon the television screen. What is it?" I stammered, my voice a mixture of concern and bewilderment. I leaned over, peering at the television screen, but I saw nothing, only a blank, blue screen, the default display of a VCR with no active input. I repeated my question, my anxiety escalating with each passing second. She remained speechless, her body trembling, but she reached out, her hand shaking, and pressed the rewind button on the VCR. A few agonizing seconds later, she pressed play, and then, with a gentle pat on the space beside her, indicated that I should sit down. The tape resumed, displaying the final moments of the wedding reception. The happy couple, their faces radiant with joy, were preparing to cut the ceremonial cake. I was, at this point, thoroughly confused and increasingly annoyed. "What's going on with you?" I asked, my voice laced with a mixture of exasperation and concern. "Wait a second," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's coming." Her words were so abrupt, so unexpected, that they startled me. I remained silent, my gaze fixed on the screen, waiting with a growing sense of dread for whatever it was to appear. The couple continued their cake-cutting ritual, feeding each other small, symbolic bites. And then, abruptly, the recording cut out. Static, a hissing, crackling cacophony filled the room, the visual equivalent of white noise. Then, a new image appeared, flickering onto the screen. A man. He was staring directly at us, or rather, directly at the camera. He appeared to be in a bedroom, a dimly lit, sparsely furnished space. He moved away from the camera, revealing, with a sickening clarity, the figure of a nude woman lying on a bed. The man approached the bed, climbing onto it with a casual, almost predatory grace. And then they began to engage in the activities. "All right, baby," I said, attempting to inject a note of levity into the increasingly uncomfortable situation. Brittany snapped, her voice sharp and urgent. "Shut up!" I was, at this point, completely dumbfounded, utterly bewildered by her reaction. I felt a flush of embarrassment creeping up my neck. I had assumed, perhaps foolishly, that we were watching some sort of amateur pornography, a harmless, albeit slightly awkward, diversion. The couple continued their intimate encounter, the woman whispering, in a voice barely audible above the ambient noise. "Choke me," he complied, and I initially dismissed it as a mere kink, a consensual act of, shall we say, unconventional intimacy. Not my particular preference, but to each their own, I thought. However, the man continued to choke the woman. She began to gasp for air, her struggles becoming increasingly desperate, her hands clawing at his arms. But he didn't stop. He maintained his grip, his face a mask of something I couldn't quite decipher. He completed the act, finally releasing his hold on her throat. The couple lay there, motionless, silent, for a few agonizing moments. Then, the man turned towards the woman, his gaze fixed upon her face. He stared, his expression unreadable, for what felt like an eternity. And then, abruptly, he began to shake her, his movements frantic, desperate. He called out her name, repeatedly, his voice rising in panic. He slapped her cheeks, lightly at first, then with increasing force. But she didn't move. She remained utterly, terrifyingly still. It was at this precise moment that the horrifying truth began to dawn on me. This wasn't pornography. This wasn't some staged, consensual act. This was something far more sinister, far more profoundly disturbing. The man, his face contorted with anguish, finally seemed to comprehend the gravity of the situation. He stood up, grasping the woman by the shoulders, shaking her violently, desperately, as if attempting to rouse her from a deep, unnatural slumber. But she remained unresponsive, her body limp, lifeless. He eventually ceased his frantic efforts, slumping down onto the edge of the bed, his head buried in his hands. A low, guttural sobbing, the sound of pure, unadulterated despair, filled the room. This agonizing tableau continued for several minutes, the man's grief a palpable, suffocating presence. Then, as if suddenly remembering the camera, he reached out, his hand moving in one swift, decisive motion, and slammed it down onto the lens. The screen erupted in a blizzard of static, the hissing, crackling sound filling the room, a jarring counterpoint to the silence that had preceded it. I sat there, stunned, speechless, my mind reeling from the sheer horror of what I had just witnessed. The static continued, relentlessly, until Brittany, finally regaining her composure, pressed the stop button on the VCR, plunging the room into a blessed, albeit unsettling, silence. Dude, it was the only word I could manage to utter, a feeble expression of my utter disbelief, my profound shock. I had never, in all my years, witnessed anything remotely like that. It was beyond comprehension, beyond anything I could have possibly imagined. Brittany turned towards me, her face pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and revulsion. "What do we do?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I honestly had no answer. I was utterly lost, adrift in a sea of uncertainty and dread. I still couldn't fully process what I had seen, couldn't reconcile it with any semblance of reality. Was it real? Was it some elaborate, macabre hoax? "Let me have a smoke," I said, my voice strained, my hands shaking. "And I'll consider our options." I retreated outside, seeking the solace of the cool night air, the familiar comfort of nicotine. I needed to clear my head, to gather my thoughts, to try and make sense of the unimaginable. When I returned, my mind still reeling, I proposed the possibility, however unlikely, that it might be fake, a staged performance, a cruel and twisted prank. I couldn't bear the thought of contacting the authorities, of becoming embroiled in a potentially embarrassing and ultimately fruitless investigation, only to discover that it was all some elaborate fabrication. "Okay," she said, her voice barely a whisper. If she harbored any doubts, any reservations, she kept them to herself. Perhaps she was still in shock, still grappling with the visceral horror of what we had witnessed. I know I was. Our evening was understandably ruined. The mood was shattered, replaced by a heavy, suffocating sense of unease. I suggested that she spend the night, offering her the comfort and security of my presence, but she declined. No big deal, I thought. I understood. I knew I would struggle to sleep, my mind replaying the gruesome images over and over again. My first priority was to contact the previous owner of the tapes, the individual from whom I had acquired the box on Craigslist. I reasoned that, while the man in the video was clearly not the person I had dealt with, there was a reasonable chance that he might possess some knowledge, some insight into the origin of the recording, perhaps even the identity of the individuals involved. However, my attempts to reach him proved futile. My emails went unanswered. My phone calls went straight to voicemail, the number apparently disconnected. I even ventured to his former address, only to discover that he had moved, leaving no forwarding information. My options, it seemed, were rapidly dwindling. I was left with no alternative but to contact the authorities, to report what I had witnessed, to place the burden of investigation upon their shoulders. I delivered the tape to the police, recounting the events as accurately and dispassionately as I could. They assured me that they would review the footage and contact me if they required any further information. It was, for the moment, out of my hands. In the weeks that followed, my contact with Brittany became increasingly sporadic. She always had some excuse, some reason to avoid me. I suspected, with a growing sense of resignation, that it was only a matter of time before she terminated our relationship entirely. And then one day she called. "I can't do this anymore," she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "I haven't slept in weeks. All I see is that woman's face." There was no point in arguing, in attempting to salvage what was clearly beyond repair. I wished her well, a hollow gesture of goodwill, and hung up the phone. It would have been cruel, unrealistic, to expect her to simply get over it, to erase the trauma of what we had witnessed. I certainly hadn't managed to do so. Hundreds of cassettes have passed through my hands since that fateful night, each one a potential repository of forgotten memories, of untold stories. With space becoming an increasingly precious commodity, I have taken to selling blank tapes and duplicate copies of commercially released films, a practical, albeit somewhat melancholic, solution to my ever-growing collection. And with Brittany no longer in the picture, the simple pleasure of curling up in bed and watching these forgotten treasures has lost much of its allure. Most of my viewing now takes place in the living room, a solitary pursuit, devoid of the shared intimacy that once made it so enjoyable. To this day, every time I insert an unlabeled tape into the VCR, I experience a fleeting moment of apprehension, a subtle tremor of fear. I have had ample time to reflect upon the incident, to analyze it from every conceivable angle. When you collect these artifacts of a bygone era, these tangible remnants of other people's lives, you never truly know what secrets you might uncover, what dark, disturbing truths might be lurking beneath the surface of seemingly innocuous recordings. The potential for discovery, for unearthing the unexpected, is both the allure and the inherent danger of this peculiar hobby. The unknown is always there, a constant companion, a reminder of the fragility of reality, the darkness that can reside within the most ordinary of objects.